So in this video, we're going to look at another claim made by lawyers from the Thirlwall inquiry representing the families that is again recounted in this article in the Sunday Times. And this is this time in relation to child G. So scroll down to the section on child G, which is here. Child G was left with quadriplegic cerebral palsy requiring round-the-clock care after being attacked in September 2015 by Letby. That's not a fact. After being allegedly attacked. Who either overfed the baby or injected air into its stomach. It's one or the other. We can't be certain. It's just one. Either she overfed it, or she injected air, or was it milk, or was it... Anyway. The Letby panel said child G had an infection, possibly enterovirus, which caused vomiting and a deterioration in its health, and that there was no evidence to support air injection into the stomach or overfeeding. But the lawyers for the family say Letby's experts did not make any reference to an important part of the prosecution case. The family's lawyers said, rather than being critically unwell at the time of her vomit, child G was doing well, she deteriorated and became severely unwell after she was attacked. Now, what you can say about this claim is, we've looked at some of the other infants in previous videos. At least in this case, what they're saying was expressed in court and can be deemed to be not completely false. In the previous two cases, the previous two infants we've looked at, what the lawyers are saying is demonstrably incorrect and demonstrably false. In this instance, at least what they're saying is true, according to what occurred in court. Where the problem lies with their assertion is that what occurred in court is so fatally flawed that it is actually ridiculous. The science that appeared in court in relation to child G and the allegations and indeed the citation of this particular collapse, two collapses, one on the 7th of September and one on the 21st of September 2015, it's just utter rubbish. And it will certainly take a certain amount of time to demonstrate this and to show you how ridiculous the case related to child G is. Of all the infants involved in the court case, this was probably the second most ridiculous. The most ridiculous is child K, where there's no medical evidence whatsoever, and arguably there is literally no evidence provided. Lucy Letby is currently facing a life sentence for child K. In this, at least there was some evidence. It was still unbelievably weak, unbelievably tenuous, highly specious, and something that has been roundly criticised by essentially everyone that I've spoken to. It's kind of universal condemnation of what occurred in court in relation to this infant. So in this video, we're going to go over why this assertion in this paragraph is extremely poorly founded. So firstly, with this infant, we're going to look at the background of the child. So this is uncontested and well established. I'm just using the Chester standard here. It's an accessible source. This child was born exceptionally premature at 23 weeks at a different hospital. We'll go into that imminently. And the child weighed just £1 and 2 ounces at birth. So I've got a Guardian article here that just explains to people that don't know the imperial system very well, such as myself, that this equals 535 grams. So the baby was extremely premature and extremely low birth weight. So to put it into context, 535 grams, it's about half the size of a bag of sugar. A typical bag of sugar that you buy from the supermarket is a kilogram. This baby's half the size of that bag of sugar in terms of weight. I couldn't say precisely how big it was in size, but I'd imagine it couldn't be much bigger than the palm of your hand. I mean, I don't know what it's like for other people thinking about that, but personally for me, it's difficult to imagine a human being that is that small. I think it would be hard for anyone to imagine who hasn't worked in neonatology An experienced neonatal practitioner, whether a nurse or a doctor, will be able to tell you exactly how large or small, I should say, really, the child would likely to be at that body weight. But clearly, it's just hard to imagine a human being can be half the size of a bag of sugar. But that was the situation for this infant, and that's because it was born weeks, in fact months before it should have been. So already its chances of survival are very very small, as we shall go on to shortly. It should be noted this child has survived, has very challenging health conditions, and I mean it's truly tragic that the parents that that are coping with the huge difficulties associated with the condition of this infant have been given the impression that this would never have happened without Lucy Letby injecting milk into this infant. And we're going to get into the milk stuff later on, but it should have been properly communicated to them that, I mean, it must be a very difficult thing. I mean, I'm not a healthcare professional. I don't know how you deal with a situation of parents are in a hospital, they want their child to survive, obviously, they don't want to hear bad news, but the prognosis is bad. I don't know how that's dealt with. I don't know how honest you are. I don't know how, obviously, it needs to be done delicately, but I feel it should be communicated to them that, look, your child is extremely premature. Obviously, you're aware of this, and it probably won't survive. And if it does survive, it's very likely to be disabled. I mean, that must be an incredibly difficult thing to say to parents. I'm glad it's not my job, um, but I feel if it was me and I was a parent of a child, I wouldn't want to be told, "Oh, don't worry, everything will be fine. We'll just nurse it for a few days, and it'll, she, I should say, will be fine." I just don't feel that's the right message to send out. Of course, we don't know what was said at the time, but we know from this document from Thirlwall that I'm about to go over, it does seem that the parents were given the impression that their child was going to be okay or was okay. And I think that's, I just don't think that's right, given that that was not the prognosis at all. So moving on to this document from the Thirlwall inquiry, I'm just going to read this paragraph here. The parents of child G struggle to conceive. She is their first and only child. It's a tragic case. Her mother's pregnancy was complicated by antenatal bleeding at 9 weeks and 22 weeks, although scans revealed a non-sinister cause. Now, I just want to highlight this a second. Scans revealed a non-sinister cause. Now, this could just be very bad writing, and it could be misuse of the word sinister, possibly. I don't think it is, but it's possible that they don't mean the word sinister, and they should have used the word malignant, for example, or some other medical term. If they have used the word sinister as intended and as it should be used, and they genuinely mean that there wasn't a sinister cause for the bleeding at 22 weeks and 9 weeks, that's just such a bizarre. We've witnessed a lot of strange things being said in relation to this case, but how would there be a sinister cause when the baby's in the womb and it hasn't been born yet? I mean, are they saying, it needed, like somehow Lucy Letby could have got to this child when the mother was still pregnant? I mean, it's such a strange, weird, irrational statement to say that these scans revealed a non-sinister cause. Why would there be a sinister cause? I mean, the mother's still pregnant. This is an embryo. Anyway, just moving on. But I mean, if you were to go through all the number of times you see things written in these Thirlwall documents, that is just almost surreal in its stupidity, is just staggering. People got paid hundreds of thousands. This inquiry, even back in September, when it had another 6 months to run, it had already racked up a bill of 10 million, and that's mostly lawyers' costs. It's not like they did any research. I mean, to be fair, they did draw a lot of documents together, but it's all lawyers' fees. I mean, people got paid an absolute fortune to put this stuff together. Anyway, there was a non-sinister cause for these bleeds, and Child G's parents were reassured that the pregnancy was proceeding normally. When Child G's mother was 23 weeks into a pregnancy, she experienced another bleed accompanied by a leak of amniotic fluid. It should be said that this was the week where she gave birth as well. So she's had problems in week 22, she's had problems in week 23, She's had a major bleed accompanied by a leak of amniotic fluid. Now, I'm no doctor, but that doesn't sound great. It doesn't sound like something that's supposed to happen. And then the child was born many, many weeks before it was supposed to. So this is all extremely bad for the prognosis of child G, unfortunately. The child was assessed at the Cancer Chester, but was advised that they were not equipped to deal with babies before 28 weeks. So this wasn't the only infant from Lucy Letby's case that was born before 28 weeks. I know child K was born, I think, after 25 weeks. I'd have to look up the figures and tell you exactly which infants were born before 28 weeks. But I know, obviously, this infant is. I know child K was as well. And of course, she's had to be born in another hospital because they can't deal with anything before 28 weeks. So it's transferred to Arrow Park Hospital. So this is, I don't know if I've mentioned this in a video, I've written in my book, but 11 of these infants were transferred to other hospitals. I mean, that's pretty staggering in itself. Like, these extremely vulnerable children are being transferred back and forwards. And if you see, it's acknowledged in the Thirlwall documents that this is not good for the child's health. I mean, it's hardly surprising that they're extremely vulnerable infants and they're being transferred back and forth between Chester and Liverpool. I mean, it doesn't really seem like something that should occur. And it's clear, really, from that statement alone, that this infant shouldn't have been at the Cancer Chester. I mean, I would argue they shouldn't have been dealing with any of these babies, and that's why the unit was downgraded. But it becomes very clear from the picture related to these infants, when you read into it, that it's probable that the overwhelming majority, if not all of them, just simply should have been dealt with at other hospitals. They should have been born at other hospitals, they should have been treated at other hospitals, and they would have had a better chance at the hospitals. I don't see how anyone could reasonably disagree with that. Mother G was therefore transferred to Arrow Park Hospital, where she gave birth in May 2015 at 23 weeks and 6 days gestation. Given her extreme prematurity, child G was extremely vulnerable and required maximal support, but seemed to do well, and her parents were told that she was making good progress. So this is what I mean about, was it actually conveyed to her parents that this child was extremely vulnerable and required maximal support? Now, we're going to go into what is meant by the term maximal support in due course. After a few weeks, she was able to breathe on her own, she grew, and brain scans were interpreted as showing positive signs. So this was an incredibly vulnerable infant, and even today, it'd be 50-50, possibly less than 50-50, whether this infant would survive. But back in 2015, the situation was different. So I want to show you this study from 2015, survival and morbidity of preterm children born at 22 through 34 weeks gestation in France. Now you can see the number of people that have worked on this. It must have been an incredibly detailed, coordinated study. It's one of the most authoritative studies of preterm children that's probably ever been published. So if you scroll down, you'll see here that excuse me, a total of 0.7% of infants born before 24 weeks gestation survived to discharge. 31.2% of those born at 24 weeks. So the odds were severely against this infant surviving. Ironically, although I fully acknowledge the situation with the parents is now very difficult, I mean, I hope they can get, I don't know what the consequences are of the the level of disability the child has. I'm not an expert on that. I accept there'll be serious challenges for the parents and for the child, but I'm sure that they would prefer the child to be alive rather than not alive, and I would assume and hope that they can, derive some joy from the child's life. And I don't know what the situation is exactly, but in a sense, they're fortunate the child survived, particularly at the Cancer Chester. So I just also, to underline this, I did a quick question to ChatGPT just to reiterate. I just asked, what is the likely survival rate for a baby born at 23 weeks in 2015? In 2015, the survival rate for a baby born at 23 weeks gestation was relatively low, around 30% to 35%. Survival was higher at well-equipped hospitals, level 3. So this was a level 2, a bad level 2. and if the baby received active intervention like ventilation and surfactant. The rate of survival without major disability was lower, only about 10 to 15%. So as I mentioned here, outcomes have continued to improve since then. By the 2020s, survival rates at 23 weeks have increased to close to 50% in some centres with aggressive care. I would still say, even today, at the Cancer Chester, considering what we know about the hospital, considering the fact it was a level 2 unit, considering the fact it was downgraded to a level 1 unit, considering they had sewage on the unit, all these babies have got sepsis, or 9 of the 17 have. This is another baby with sepsis, as we'll move on to discussing. They're understaffed, underskilled, no experience, no neonatologists on the unit. They're not doing ward rounds. There's no way, even today, this baby would have a 50% chance. At the time, it must have had a remote chance of survival. So that's really the kind of background, or that's the introduction to the background to this infant, but I'm going to go over some more details related to its background as well. So there's quite a lot to go through in this section, so I'm going to do my best to go through it as logically as possible. I'm going to begin by looking at the witness statement of Dr. Rachel Chang from the Thirlwall Inquiry, INQ 0018070. And this just really backs up the impression in this paragraph that this is a very vulnerable infant. Baby G was born at 23 weeks gestation and so was very prematurely. I don't know why it's written so badly, but babies born at this level of prematurity, edge of viability, are inherently extremely vulnerable and can become unstable as they are physiologically extremely premature. Her deterioration would not have been surprising to me, as deteriorations of this or similar nature are often seen with this highly vulnerable patient population. Now, not only is that significant, but it's important to reiterate that all the way through this court case, and indeed with regard to child G, Dr. Dewi Evans in particular, Dr. Sandy Bowen as well to a great extent, constantly communicated the impression to the court that, oh, this baby was doing well, it was basically fine, and then it just collapsed for no reason. The only possible explanation is malignant intentional harm. Which is so ridiculously inaccurate in the case of many of these infants that it really beggars belief. The first thing to mention is just because an infant is stable, all the condition stable means is that it's not deteriorating any further. You can be on the verge of death and be stable. In fact, you can be in a coma and be stable, as has been, I believe that was the case before I began this project, and now medics have explained to me, yeah, if you're in a coma, you're stable. You can be literally brain dead, so you're never going to regain consciousness, but you can still be stable. Your heart can still be beating. You can still be breathing. So the fact that an infant is stable, while it is a good indication generally, broadly speaking, it is not an indication that that infant has recovered and will now not experience any further problems. Or indeed that patient, it can be a patient much, much older, much stronger, much bigger, let alone a 23 weeks extremely premature infant that, as we've established, weighs half the weight of a bag of sugar. So moving on to another statement that backs this up. This is Caroline Bennion. Her witness statement was suppressed by the Thirlwall Inquiry until 17th of February 2025, which is a bit strange because she submitted it 10 months before that. But we'll just have a look at what she had to say. So it's pretty much just reiterating what I've stated already. An extreme preterm baby like child G had the capacity to become unwell very quickly. So a few indicators of deterioration, low blood count, low temperature, is not something that would indicate a potential deterioration may occur. So it's just reiterating really that an extreme preterm baby is vulnerable. Hardly a controversial or contentious opinion, one would have to say. And of course, I should emphasise as well, I've spoken to many nurses, many medics, many people who have a lot of knowledge about this subject, and nurses in particular, who you should understand that they are dealing with the infants on a day-to-day basis. They are there. They are the presence that is observing the infants more than anyone else. They will say neonates can collapse very quickly. They can deteriorate very quickly. It happens all the time. Even relatively healthy neonates that are nowhere near as premature as this, that are not having the same catalogue of health problems, they can deteriorate and they can die. It's a sad part of life, but incredible breakthroughs have been made in infant mortality. It's beyond the scope of this video to discuss this, but if you look at the infant mortality rate over decades, it's come down massively, and it's still nudging down, even though it's come down hugely from, say, 1950 or 1960. It's absolutely plummeted to a very low level compared to what it was historically. That is actually the primary reason why life expectancy has increased so much. But even with the best will in the world, and even though breakthroughs are still being made, and even though the prognosis of this infant will be better today even than 8-9 years ago, the sad reality is if you're born 23 weeks, I believe that's 4 months before you're supposed to be born. It's gonna make you very, very vulnerable. I mean, this is just prosaic observation, really. So I've asked a question to ChatGPT here. Again, the answer to this question is blindingly obvious, but are extremely premature babies particularly vulnerable to sudden collapses and deterioration? I mean, if the answer to this question was no, it would be pretty staggering. But yes, extremely premature babies, typically those born before 28 weeks of gestation, are indeed particularly vulnerable to sudden collapses and deterioration. They can be stable when this happens. They can be in a condition of relative stability, and then they suddenly collapse and deteriorate. This fragility stems from the immaturity of virtually every organ system in their bodies. Here are some of the main reasons, and goes on to cite immature respiratory system, fragile brain and blood vessels, unstable cardiovascular system, immature immune system, difficulty regulating temperature and blood sugar, feeding and gastrointestinal risks. Essentially, because their organ systems are so immature and the reserves are limited, even a relatively minor issue can escalate quickly in extremely premature infants. That's why they require constant monitoring and support in neonatal intensive care units. This is another point. So it's clear from what we know about this unit that the quality of monitoring at the unit was extremely poor. And this is something, again, that's been cited to me by numerous nurses who say it's obvious that they weren't monitoring these infants correctly. Firstly, they weren't simply doing the monitoring that was required. And then secondly, even if you're monitoring something, it's no good me going in there and monitoring an infant. I haven't got a clue what to look for. I don't have a nursing degree. I don't know anything about neonates apart from what I've learned over the last 2 years. But that wouldn't qualify me to be a neonatal nurse, clearly. So obviously they had neonatal nurses on the unit, and I'm not saying all those nurses were bad, but it's very clear that they were understaffed, and it's very clear that they were underskilled, and it's very clear that they had a lack of experience. That is evidenced by the fact that Lucy, who wasn't at a university for very long, was considered one of the more senior nurses. And I know for a fact, because I've spoken to someone who worked at the hospital, that she wrote some of the policy for the hospital, which would never happen because she's still basically a relatively low-ranking, inexperienced nurse, and yet she has something of an air of seniority about her. And that's indicative of the problems they're having on this unit. And if this constant monitoring isn't taking place with this infant that's born 4 months before it should have been, that's half the size of a bag of sugar, etc., and that has many other problems that we're going to move on to discuss, you can miss these subtle signs, or you may not even have the knowledge to understand these subtle signs. So one of the things that we hear constantly stated, or stated with regularity, from people on the unit is, we'd never seen this before. But the reason they probably hadn't seen it before was lack of experience and lack of knowledge. And another thing that a neonatal nurse said to me is, if you're going to work in neonatology, and if you're going to do it over a long period of time, and if you're going to work with these very vulnerable and premature babies, you're going to see things that you haven't seen before with regularity. That's going to happen all the time because they have all these compromised issues that were discussed here. So the fact that they saw things that they hadn't seen before is not in itself particularly significant. But again, it was presented in the court case as being hugely significant. So I'm just going to move on to a couple of papers, just a bit of research that backs up what I've already said. I'll look at the other one first, actually. I'll come back to look at that one in a second. So this is just about mortality and acute complications in preterm infants. Just simply says, obviously there's a hell of a lot more evidence than this, but I'll just read this out. Infants born preterm remain vulnerable to many complications, including respiratory distress syndrome, chronic lung disease, injury to the intestines, a compromised immune system, cardiovascular disorders, hearing and vision problems, and neurological insult. And this document, among many, it's a very, very long document, But among many, many other things, it states sepsis or meningitis is about 4 times more likely in the preterm infant, occurring in almost 25% of very low birth weight infants. Now, of course, child G, in common with many of the other infants in this court case, had suspected sepsis. The child was transferred to Arrow Park Hospital in Liverpool, where it was treated for sepsis. So there's 2 things to note here. Firstly, the infant's been transferred backwards and forwards between these 2 hospitals, and secondly, it's been treated for sepsis. Obviously, in an already vulnerable infant, that is extremely problematical. So if we move on to the next thing, this is a statement from the Thirlwall inquiry. It's a family statement. I can't show you the kind of preview page because there isn't one, because Thirlwall haven't managed to create one. But in paragraph 23, there's discussion of the child being at Arrow Park Hospital and being transferred. And it's note that her parents would have preferred her to remain at Arrow Park, but were initially happy with her progress. And then there's some discussion of the child showing signs of improvement. But essentially, this child is being transferred back and forth between a hospital that is suitable for looking after it and a hospital that is not suitable for caring for it, which was the case at Chester, where it experienced all these difficulties. And this is a witness statement from the Thirlwall inquiry of the very significant Dr. Stephen Breary. And in paragraph 157, he states, the doctors at Arrow Park Hospital felt at the time that child G had collapsed due to sepsis, and I agreed with them at the time for a number of reasons. Child G's blood test for CRP, a marker for infection, had risen since the collapse from normal to 28 and then 106. She had a metabolic acidosis and she was requiring drug infusions to maintain her blood pressure. These are the facts that I also discussed with child G's parents later in the clinical notes from 23rd of August 2016. We also discussed the MRI scan child G had that month during this meeting. The parents attributed the MRI changes and child G's evolving symptoms of cerebral palsy to the events on 7th of September 2015, which I think is reasonable. However, I was cautious in categorically agreeing with their opinion because child G had been born in the toilet of the ward at Arrow Park Hospital. I don't know how normal that is, but it does seem slightly unusual. At 23 weeks gestation, and babies born less than 24 weeks gestation who survive that start in life have a high risk of cerebral palsy and disability, whatever the results of early MRI scans. I arranged a clinic appointment with a paediatric neurologist so that the parents were fully informed. So another thing to reflect on that I'll just briefly mention at this point is this must be an awful experience for the parents. This child was in various hospitals for quite a significant period of time after being born, and it must be horrible to go home and leave. I don't know if they were literally resident in the hospital. I presume they're going home at some point, but this is going on for weeks and weeks, and the child's experiencing all these problems and they can't take their child home. And the reason for that is the child will not survive outside of a neonatal unit because, for example, it's being ventilated all the way through its life. So it must be a horrible experience, and one can only sympathise with the parents. And I do think it's something that we need to consider because, I haven't been through something like that personally, but I recall the next door neighbour of my mother, they had a stillbirth, and I remember I don't think it was a stillbirth. I've forgotten the precise medical explanation, but their child didn't survive, and that truly it was awful. It was awful. It was. I didn't know them personally, but it was just incredibly sad. So we should definitely remain aware of the fact that these parents have been through an awful experience, and it must have been truly harrowing for them. So to move on to the next part, this is INQ 0098315, witness statement of Dr. Christopher Booth, who worked at the hospital at the time. This is another one they didn't bother releasing until February, who knows why. And Dr. Christopher Booth said, from my recollection, the consensus was that child G's condition instability was a possible symptom of sepsis. Babies do vomit, and so child G's projectile vomiting did not cause me significant concern at the time. Remember, all of these people are observing the infant in real time. They're not just looking back at the notes retrospectively, as Dr. Evans is. So another thing to note here is, this is from ITV, report. Firstly, there's an indication the medic's suspecting sepsis, but also child G required ventilation support with 100% oxygen. For most of its life, the vast majority of its life, this child was on 100% ventilation support, would have immediately died without that support, which is hardly surprising given the prematurity and the size of the infant and the fact that it's being treated for sepsis and the other problems with the infant that we're going to go on and discuss. Indeed, this is in November 2016. This is an email from Dr. Stephen Breary. I think it's to Sue Eardley, if I remember correctly. Yes, it is. This is after Lucy Letby's been removed from the unit. They're still talking about sepsis in the case of child G. And this is Dr. John Gibbs. This is from the Thirlwall inquiry on the 1st of October 2024. So Dr. John Gibbs here is giving evidence to the Thirlwall inquiry, and he says, could I just add with child G, I feel I was misleading myself. He wasn't misleading himself. He just changed his opinion, but it's clear at the time his opinion was that child G was a very vulnerable baby, extremely premature baby. She had a number of collapses. Now, please remember that. That's going to become relevant later in the video, but please remember this infant had a number of collapses. I now know that some of those collapses were induced by Letby. You don't know that. You don't know that. You've been told that. I didn't realise that at the time. So I felt that this is a baby who is prone to collapses, so I wasn't too surprised when that baby had a few difficult spells on that day. And I must say, when we come to it, the same applies to child I. Of course, I've dealt with child I previously in these videos. So again, this is same day's Thirlwall proceedings, and here it's still Dr. John Gibbs being interviewed. And the reason I say that it was a sudden collapse and child I did it twice that same night, but as you already recounted a few weeks earlier over consecutive nights, child I had had serious collapses and consultants had been called in each time. So a little like child G, I had gained the impression that child I was quite a vulnerable, very premature baby, had been a very premature baby and was prone to these collapses. I didn't realise then that the early collapses have now been attributed to harm by Letby, so I thought this was a baby who was quite precarious, who decompensated quickly. So that is perfectly normal. It's a perfectly normal medical conclusion, and that was the conclusion that Dr. John Gibbs drew at the time. So this is, returning to this person here, Dr. Rachel Chan, and her witness statement from the Thirlwall inquiry. And she talks here about whether she was asked about being surprised or concerned at the episodes of child G. I cannot recall any particular feelings of surprise from myself or others about this. Similarly, I have no recollection of feelings of concern with regards to this episode beyond my concern about the immediate need to care for and stabilise child G. I do not recall anyone else expressing concerns about child G's deterioration during the morning either, because they knew it was very likely to deteriorate. The infant is very likely to deteriorate for all the reasons discussed previously. So, that's in fact the same statement. So the last thing that I just want to move on to is just something that I've written in my book, which is, this is just a record of the other ailments that have been discussed. So aside from the innate vulnerability that we've already discussed, child G was suffering with a catalogue of serious ailments. These included decreased lung capacity and chronic lung disease, hyaline membrane disease, bilateral pulmonary interstitial emphysema, which is a serious lung condition, hypoglycemia, gastroesophageal reflux. I was so pleased when I saw this because I know what that is because I used to suffer with that. It's where stomach acid comes up from the stomach into the esophagus. Thrombocytopenia, which is a low blood platelet count, which is very serious, and blood gases indicating signs of sepsis. Dr. Shu Lee described child G as an infant with a lot of chronic problems. Indeed, child G was treated for infection, having been transferred to Arrow Park Hospital, with the watery green stool of the infant pointing to likely gastroenteritis. There were also documented medical mistakes made with the already vulnerable child G, including delayed intubation, a prolonged application of the DOPE acronym, which provides ventilation guidance. Of course, this child is being ventilated for the overwhelming majority of its life, and an episode in which the baby was left behind a screen without a monitor on, during which she experienced a cardiorespiratory event. Again, this is very important because we're going to return to this. It's likely that doctors made mistakes with the monitoring of this infant. So that's a lot of information on the background of child G. So what I'm going to do now is just summarise all of that information. So to summarise this initial section, child G is an extremely low birth weight infant weighing just 535 grams, whose gestation ended highly prematurely some 4 months before its expected birth. The baby is therefore extremely vulnerable and would not have been expected to survive. Furthermore, it is very likely that the child will suffer with serious disability in the event of survival. Child G couldn't even be born at the Countess of Chester because they weren't allowed to take her. This led to the infant being transferred back and forth repeatedly between Arrow Park and the Countess of Chester. Because of the infant's innate vulnerability, numerous medical staff were not even slightly surprised when this baby deteriorated and collapsed. Indeed, extremely premature babies are inherently vulnerable to deterioration and collapse. Child G had to be ventilated through the vast majority of her life. This was literally keeping her alive. Child G was treated for sepsis at Arrow Park Hospital, and numerous medics cited sepsis as being significant in the child's deterioration and struggles. The child experienced multiple collapses and incidences of vomiting. Child G had chronic lung disease from the moment of birth. Child G was also suffering with a catalogue of serious ailments, which led Dr. Shuley to describe her as an infant with a lot of chronic problems. So that's really the background to how unwell, how small, how premature, how vulnerable this infant was. In the next section of this video, we're going to go on to discuss some issues related to Dr. Evans. So in this second section, we're going to discuss some comments made by Dr. Dowie Evans. And the reasons for this will soon become apparent. This was during court proceedings in relation to child C. So it's not in relation to the child that we're discussing currently, but there is a reason why I'm discussing this. So when he was giving evidence in court, Dr. Evans told prosecutor Nick Johnson, one problem that can cause a baby to suddenly stop breathing is if the abdomen is filled with air. A baby can tolerate a certain amount of gas in his abdomen, but if you get a significant amount of air in the stomach, it will cause splinting of the diaphragm. If you get a kind of pressure in your abdomen, that diaphragm cannot move, then you get a splinter. Then you will soon suffocate and collapse pretty quickly. And then Ben Myers cross-examined Dr. Evans on the same day and stated, if you really thought that splinting the diaphragm was the cause of death, you would have stated that before today, wouldn't you? Dr. Evans said, in virtually all of the cases, I have benefited from additional information since then. I suggest that you have been driven by something that leads you to support the allegation rather than by the facts. Dr. Evans replied, the fact is this baby collapsed. I mean, just frankly, an embarrassing portion of cross-examination. It's interesting to me that at one time when Dr. Evans was initially coming under fire, he would say, people haven't seen the court case, so you don't know what happened in court. Now, I assume he was hoping that no one ever would see what happened in court, because repeatedly when he's cross-examined in court, it is an absolute train wreck from any kind of scientific perspective. And this is one of those situations where he just gives an answer that is just utterly specious. But it happens all the time. You'd be surprised, if you haven't seen the court transcripts, you'd be surprised how much it happens. So Ben Myers continues, Dr. Evans, you've explained today that your conclusion is that the cause of death in child C's case arose from the splinter of the diaphragm. That is the mechanics of that, yes, is correct. You've had the relevant clinical material and the statements relating to child C for over 5 years or thereabouts, haven't you? Yes. You've considered other cases featuring in this trial where you have provided reports giving the opinion that splintering the diaphragm is a cause of death, like child G. So that's why I'm mentioning this, because this opinion that he suddenly came up with during the court case, having changed his opinion, in previous reports he would say this child was extremely unwell. He would say things like, we may never know why this child passed away. He mentioned infection in previous reports. Then magically, when the court case came along, all of a sudden there were these brand new diagnoses. Infection was nowhere to be seen. The hospital was nowhere to be seen as a player in the story. And the idea that it wasn't possible to say how the baby collapsed, that when all of a sudden he knew 100%, and it was always due to the malignant behaviour of Lucy Letby. So we're seeing that, and of course this happened over a period of 5 years. The panels produced these reports in months. these very forensic, very detailed reports. You can tell that even by looking at the preview documents. Dr. Philip Hammond's seen the final documents and said that they're very impressive. Hard to say the same thing for Dr. Evans when he's continually changing his opinion. And another thing I'd like to mention as well is he mentioned or semi-complained about the fact that he hadn't been able to speak to anyone from the hospital, but he had 5 years to do this. But then he was changing his opinion based on what he apparently encountered from other statements. But he actually could interview people directly, but he himself said, I couldn't do that. Very difficult to understand why. So Ben Myers goes on to say, you've considered other cases featuring in this trial where you have provided reports. Oh, I've just read that. That's just establishing that the same assertion was made with regard to child G. Before today, just now, you've never suggested that splinter diaphragm on 13th of June is the cause of death for child C, have you? That's correct. This is the first time we're hearing it right now, isn't it? Yes. So this goes on and on in the court case. Now, in a previous video, I've already shown this letter from Channel 5 where Dr. Evans states, none of the babies were killed as a direct result of the injection of air or fluid in air deliberately injected into their stomachs. Several were destabilised. This is an indication in the letter to Channel 5 that he's changed his diagnoses. What I really wanted to highlight as well is he's talking about the injection of fluid and air leads to abdominal distension. So he's talking about fluid, suddenly it's fluid and air together. The injection of fluid and air leads to abdominal distension, splinter the diaphragm, and respiratory collapse. This was seen most dramatically in the case of infant G. But what he should have, besides that, he's firstly given a very misleading impression of what was said in court. And then secondly, when he's saying it was most dramatically seen in the case of infant G, that was the only case in which there was this notion of the injection of fluid in air. He's put fluid there and then air in brackets as if fluid is really significant. And then he's implied, oh, it was seen most dramatically in the case of infant G, as if this was also seen in all of the other cases. Now, he presumably hoped that by writing to Channel 5, Channel 5 would think, oh my God, we've got everything wrong, we'll pull the programme, and then his opinion would never go under the microscope on TV. Now, it's going to go under the microscope on TV a lot more, that's for sure. But I think he just hoped, oh, if I say some stuff to Channel 5 and try and muddy the waters and blind them with some complex stuff, then they'll get scared and they'll pull the programme. So that's why I think he said this thing about, oh, it was always fluid and air and that's destabilised them. And yeah, it was seen most dramatically in the case of child G, because he knows that fluid was mentioned in the case of child G, but it wasn't mentioned most dramatically. It was the only relevant case in which any form of fluid was mentioned. Now, before anyone picks me up on that, I'm aware that it was also mentioned in the case of child Q. That wasn't milk, it was I believe, but the combination of fluid and air was mentioned in that case. Of course, what is significant about child Q is that Lucy Letby was found not guilty. So we see in the Court of Appeal judgment here, which is this document that's on the screen now, all of these babies, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I, L, M, N, O, P. Of course, we don't see Q because Lucy Letby's found not guilty. We don't see H, we don't see J, where that also applies. Then we see the mechanism, air embolus, excuse me, air via nasogastric tube, air embolus, acute bleeding, air embolus, insulin poisoning, air via nasogastric tube, air embolus, insulin poisoning, air embolus, throat trauma, injury to liver, air embolus, air via nasogastric tube. We only see overfeeding of milk here in relation to child G. The reason for that is it wasn't mentioned with regard to any of the other infants. So I wanted to bring that in because this notion of splintering the diaphragm that was mentioned with regard to child G, it was introduced with regard to child C. That occurred during the court case, quite rightly as the cross-examination of Ben Myers points out. This was after 5 years that this was finally introduced during the court case. And Dr. Evans here in his Channel 5 letter has tried to suggest, I said all the way through the court case, I said there was an injection of fluid or air. But unfortunately, the Court of Appeal document indicates that wasn't the case. It's known that's not the case. I mean, it's hard to represent this as anything else other than a deliberate misrepresentation. Now, I'm not going to make any allegations regarding why Dr. Evans has said certain things in court and also in this letter. It's really up to Dr. Evans to explain that. At the heart of Child G, as mentioned, is this notion that Lucy Letby has overfed the infant with milk. So this is something that when I spoke to healthcare professionals, and I've spoken to numerous, this was treated with complete derision. It wasn't just rejected or said to be inaccurate or that there were better explanations or that the science that had been presented in court was fundamentally flawed. I mean, it is just viewed as utterly laughable. And we're just going to discuss that element of the case in this section, beginning with this witness statement of Alison Ventris, another one that was held back until February 2025 by the Thirlwall inquiry. And firstly, she talks about this supposed projectile vomit. So she says here, in terms of Child G's large projectile vomit, it is hard to comment on the issue with no recollection of the incident, instantly indicating that this was not viewed as significant at the time. Just as this equally applies to the insulin cases. I'm going to make a series of videos about the insulin cases after I finish this series. The insulin cases were not flagged at the time. They weren't properly tested at the time. No one was concerned about them at the time. Of course, the infants didn't pass away. They survived and recovered. If they were ever in actual trouble, there's no particular indication they were in trouble. And this is another case where no one saw anything that occurring on the unit as being unusual. The only thing that's really been flagged as being unusual are these rashes, and that seems to be due to ignorance. But certainly here, the vomiting was obviously noticed by staff, otherwise it wouldn't be in the case notes. But it wasn't viewed as being unduly unnatural or unduly alarming. Indeed, she says here, babies vomit frequently for many reasons, and the description of vomits is extremely subjective. I don't give much attention to how big or projectile the vomit is reported for a single vomit. Rather, I would assess the baby's condition, and that would impact my management more than the description of the vomit. I cannot recall if I saw the vomit myself or if it was just reported to me by a nurse. Then we go on to this witness statement of the infamous Dr. Stephen Breary from July 2024. And he says simply, I had never heard of air or milk being forced into a baby's stomach before, and it didn't cross my mind that this might have caused Child G's collapse. So the mechanism of this supposed overfeeding of milk was, as I say, roundly ridiculed by pretty much everyone that I've spoken to, and I would be amazed if you could find anyone that's involved in neonatology anywhere in the world who will support this mechanism of inflicted harm and say that it's feasible and say that it's credible. I certainly haven't encountered anyone. Dr. Philip Hammond hasn't encountered anyone. No one has come forward to say that it's possible. All of the feedback that I've had, which is, as I say, derision towards this theory, would indicate the complete opposite. So it wouldn't surprise me if you asked every single neonatologist and every single neonatal nurse in the entire world, do you think this is feasible? It wouldn't surprise me if there isn't a single person that said, yes, I think it's feasible. I can't actually perform that survey, but it is so unlikely, so ridiculous, so poorly founded that it beggars belief that it was put in a court case. However, there are, not only is it unfeasible, but there are massive logistical issues and other issues as well. So firstly, in order to even make this assertion in court, there had to be an estimation of the amount of milk both left in the stomach of an infant and that was actually vomited, as it was naturally impossible to measure either of these. So when Dr. Evans, it's actually, I might go over that part from the court transcripts because it's actually comical. If Lucy Letby wasn't in prison and this wasn't so serious, it would be comical, the sub-GCSE level discourse that takes place. I mean, if it was a GCSE project, you wouldn't give it a passing grade. It's that bad. And this is in a court case that's supposed to have expert medical witnesses and did decide whether or not someone retains their liberty or goes to prison for multiple life sentences. mean, frankly, the science and the maths involved was utterly ridiculous, laughable. Second thing is making claims regarding the aspiration of milk that did not match the statement by the nurse which performed the act. So we've seen this already. I actually referenced this statement already, but they had to make assertions regarding this aspiration that are not actually evidentially supported. Dr. Evans then had to ignore the fact that any such supposed overfeeding is far more likely to be accidental. It's not unfeasible. There could be an overfeeding of milk that occurred accidentally. I'm sure that has occurred. I'm sure mothers have occasionally accidentally. Well, it happens quite regularly. I'm sure people have generally seen footage or even seen it in the real world of an infant drinking too much milk and it'll like blub it out of its nose, or it'll cough, or it'll. Sometimes it's not inconceivable that if you bottle fed an infant too much, I can't see it happening with breastfeeding. But I suppose if you bottle fed an infant too much, it's not inconceivable that you could overfeed it. But it'd be very difficult. I'm going to come on to the mechanism of this in a second. But even then, I think you really, really struggle to identify cases of infants that have been killed or seriously, their life seriously threatened by the use of the overfeeding of milk. And it also doesn't really make any sense because it wasn't needed in any of the other cases. So although Dr. Evans has written this letter to Channel 5 suggesting that, oh yeah, Child G was just the most obvious or the most dramatic example of this, it's the only example in the court case as we've established. In no other case did he even allege that Lucy Letby overfed an infant with milk. So why did she do it in this case? Firstly, it's extremely difficult to do. Secondly, it's very likely the infant is going to vomit it out. Indeed, it did vomit, or more likely burp it out or blub it out before it gets anywhere near the stomach. And then thirdly, she's already supposedly attacked infants using mechanisms other than this, and supposedly that was successful. So why should she suddenly resort to milk? Then, of course, she'd never searched for any of this. This is an incredibly obscure attempt to destabilise an infant that has never been seen before. I mean, I don't think it ever would have been seen in any court case or any allegation ever before. And yet Lucy Letby's come up with it herself without ever searching for it, because we know she didn't search for it. She didn't search for it for any of the murder methods. So, and then, of course, the mechanism of doing it, as we're going to come on to in a second, is extremely difficult to the point of being logistically impossible. So you put all those things together. There's still more points to come, though. As I mentioned, the logistics. It's very unlikely that you would overfeed an infant with a bottle, but at least with a bottle, you could say, yes, the infant could take in a significant amount of milk in quite a short period of time with large gulps. I suppose it's possible. But the implication here is that she used a tiny syringe to inject milk into the stomach, and then she did that before the infant could blub it out or sniff it out. I'm sure everyone's seen infants expelling milk through their nose. And of course, it vomited it out, but it didn't manage to vomit it all out. And that it's complete crap. It's utter crap. The mechanism involved is just never going to happen. There's absolutely no chance. It would be very difficult to get this effect. I'd say still bordering on impossible with a bottle, but to do it with a small syringe, there's just absolutely no chance. Or did he say it was down the nasogastric tube on this occasion? But it was an injection anyway. It wasn't by a normal method of feeding. So, I mean, it's just absolute. And this, I don't know I haven't got the precise logistics in front of me. I've looked at the precise logistics of when there are people around and so on and so forth. Very difficult to do on a busy neonatal unit as well. And then as well, I haven't mentioned this in these documents. I should have mentioned this. Lucy Letby reported the vomit on which she was convicted. Lucy Letby put that in the notes. Lucy Letby raised the alarm at the time. That is not disputed. That's not contested. That was in the court case. So you put all these things together, it's absolutely ridiculous. As I say, you have to ignore everything that would be expected to occur anatomically if a baby's overfed with milk. So normally you wouldn't expect it would vomit the milk out clearly in its totality. The idea that you'd be able to inject milk into it at such a speed that it could only vomit some of it out, and then the remaining milk somehow rubbish. It's total rubbish. And then, of course, we should mention as well that Dr. Evans changed his theory several times. In fact, Dr. Evans changed his theory in real time while listening to the trial. So those are some of the reasons why, when I spoke to medical professionals, they just treated this milk allegation with, as I say, just absolute derision. If you go back to the original Guardian article from July, written by Felicity Lawrence, the Guardian interviewed several neonatologists, and they absolutely lambasted the idea of in the injection of air, whether it's via nasogastric tube or other methods. They viewed that as ridiculous. This is beyond. At least infants have been seen to be destabilised by an air embolism before. Usually they're accidental, of course. I think in basically every other case in history they're accidental. But at least there is some existing precedent for that. It's very limited, and what was asserted in court is extremely flawed. We will come on to this eventually. It's not going to be part of these videos so much, but I will make some videos on that in time. But the overfeeding of milk using a syringe there's just no way. There's absolutely no chance. It's utterly ridiculous. Even if you didn't have to go through all these things to get to it, you've got to go through all these things to get to it. Even the allegation that is ridiculous wasn't even evidentially supported. So that's why this case is just so egregious and so ridiculous. And it's a crying shame that the parent of child G, or the parents of child G, are still sitting there today believing that the medical conditions that they are dealing with today occurred due to Lucy Letby injecting milk into their infant with a syringe. I mean, it actually boggles the mind. And if I put the question to lawyers in a previous video, but I will ask again: have you conveyed to your clients the exceptional level of criticism of this case, the almost complete implausibility of what was alleged in court, and the fact that much more qualified medical experts have now come up with far stronger, more forensic explanations for what occurred that are actually, possible and plausible? Have you expressed that to your client? I don't know if you have or not, but what I can say is there is absolutely no indication that you have in this 173-page document. So if you haven't expressed it to your client, why not? So the next thing we're going to examine in this case of child G are some of the events that occurred on the neonatal unit and the discussion of these events in court. And we're going to begin by looking at a witness statement of Dr. David Harkness, who was resident at the Countess of Chester at the time, who was involved in what were deemed to be significant collapses of child G in September 2015. So we're going to look at his witness statement from the Thirlwall inquiry, which is INQ 01023550. So I'm going to read the entirety of his statement here related to child G because it firstly confirms some points that we've already raised, and secondly brings some new issues to the fore that we're going to discuss in this section. So it begins by saying, as I described in my statement made to the police on 14th of September 2018, child G had been born at Arrow Park Hospital before being transferred to the neonatal unit at the hospital, which refers to the Countess of Chester. I was involved in her care on 7th and 21st September 2015. She had suffered a few episodes of deteriorations prior to the night. So let's highlight that. She'd suffered a few episodes of deterioration. So this infant was deteriorating regularly. It was noted both in the Countess of Chester and at Arrow Park Hospital, but had up until then been considered to be quite stable. Why? But also, I mean, it doesn't... what we know about the background of this infant, in no way does this infant appear to be stable. But I suppose you could also argue, as I've mentioned previously, that all stable means is she's not, he or she, in this case a she, is not deteriorating at this point in time. You can be stable just before your death. You can be stable in a coma. We've discussed all this previously. with the acknowledgement that this could, and with premature babies often can, change very rapidly. So again, important to highlight that. Dr. Evans throughout said, babies don't just deteriorate, and here, obviously, that is a statement of sheer idiocy, I would describe it as, because it's pretty. Even right at the beginning of this, when I began researching this, it's nearly 2 years ago now. It's 18 months ago, however long it is. Even when I first heard the statement, it would have probably been in the Operation Hummingbird documentary made by the police that I'm going to do a full analysis of at some point. I think it was Mr. Paul Hughes from Cheshire Police, who was saying, "Oh, what we learnt is that babies don't just deteriorate for no reason. It's always predictable," or words to that effect. And even when I first heard that, I thought that seems very unlikely. It seems unlikely in any infant, but particularly, obviously, in a premature infant, very low birth weight in this case, etc., etc. And of course, the reason it seems unlikely is because it is unlikely because it's not true. And I think one of the most egregious aspects of this case is that the impression was communicated to the court that these children were fine and then they just suddenly collapsed for no reason, and that doesn't usually happen, or it can't happen. And it's always understood and it's always expected when an infant is going to collapse, which is what Dr. Evans has said during the court case and since the court case. And this is just simply categorically untrue. I don't see how anyone could possibly argue that, let alone someone who's worked as a paediatrician. What I would say is that I think the fact that Dr. Evans has worked on a paediatric unit with babies that are nowhere near the situation of these infants could have led him to have a rather misguided impression. Some people are more cynical about him and think that, he was nefarious to some extent. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't wish to make that allegation. I think he is quite an arrogant person who believes himself to be right about everything. And one of the statements that was made about him, that he made about himself rather, was that he said, "When I worked in Swansea, everyone deferred to my opinion," which I think is very significant. I think he's just someone who thinks, "I decide something, I'm correct, it's black and white," and you see that from the court cases where, when he's being challenged, he's quite robustly argues back, which is not really what you're supposed to do as an expert witness anyway. But you see, Dr. Bohim does that to a certain extent, but it's much more measured. And the other expert witnesses will concede things and they'll say, "Yes, it's fair. What you've made is a fair comment." Dr. Evans just cannot stand any form of criticism. Seemingly, that would be my analysis of him. And I think that's why he's spoken so much after the trial, because he just literally couldn't bear someone saying, "This guy's cocked up, this guy said this and it's right and it's wrong, this guy's incompetent or not good enough to be in this position," and he just can't stand that. It seems to me that he's built himself up in his own head to be this totemic figure, and unfortunately, he is a person, in my view, of pretty modest ability and intelligence. And the reason I would say that is that I've listened to him speak, and I was really expecting at some point that he would throw a spanner into the works and come up with some complex medical explanation for something that couldn't be easily refuted. I was really expecting him to produce something of real substance, and that just hasn't happened. When you hear him interviewed and when you see what he's had to say, it's just so trite and lacking in substance that it's incredible. I had no idea of what an expert witness would be like before I started looking at this case. He's the inverse of what I would expect. I would expect this really authoritative, forensic, surgical figure that's imposing, and now I realise that sort of figure may not be an ideal expert witness because they don't come across well in court. Him with his he's quite a nondescript, sort of mild-mannered figure, isn't he? I suppose you could describe him as. He's certainly not imposing in any way. So I've heard him described as avuncular, and he just seems unthreatening. I suppose kind. You might perceive him as, but not. He doesn't come across as someone who walks into a room and dominates the room, or walks into a room and has an enormous presence, or starts speaking and appears to be an enormous intellect, or some sort of notable intellectual, or person of particular mental capacity. He just seems like someone's granddad, really, doesn't he? He comes across as quite an innocuous figure, and actually, perhaps that works well in court in the sense that people are more receptive and they can take that on board more from someone who doesn't stand up and isn't this really forceful speaker and this really imposing presence that's almost, I wouldn't say an apologetic presence, but maybe innocuous, as I said previously, is the right word. He just comes across as a very innocuous presence. And maybe that's why he's been a successful expert witness. Obviously, being able to fit his evidence around the court case kind of helps as well. But yeah, I mean, I've gone off a bit of an aside here, but the point is, I don't know how he could ever possibly have said that it's predictable. It's always predictable when babies collapse. It's always predictable when premature infants deteriorate. It's always expected. We always know why it's happened. And he's maintained this view pretty much after the court case, pretty much universally, unanimously since. So I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know why he said that. Frankly, it's utterly ridiculous. Child G had chronic lung disease, which is common in premature babies. She was in receipt of low flow oxygen and was doing quite well on that. She was underweight and received a large volume of feeds with assistance for this through a nasal tube. She also had slightly large ventricles observed on cranial ultrasound scans, which are fluid spaces in the brain. So here, ventricles, typically we'd associate that with the heart, but I believe here it's referring to the ventricles of the brain, which is less frequently referenced, but do exist. Overall, however, her presentation was not concerning. Just apart from like the catalogue of medical issues, the fact that she was extremely vulnerable, the fact she's deteriorating all the time, but overall, it wasn't concerning. Child G had a deterioration on the evening of 6-7 September, which required her to be intubated. She was in receipt of a very high level of oxygen flow and was considered to be very sick without an obvious cause. She was treated for suspected sepsis or aspiration, which was a risk due to her large volume of feeds. So obviously, we mentioned sepsis previously. I do not remember the specifics of any conversations about Child G's deterioration that night or who those conversations were with. I cannot recall any discussion with regard to Child G having projectile vomited. At handover, it is routine to go through an overview of events as well as the current situation, ventilation, observations, results, and condition. All doctors on shift from the night and day would have been present. I am sure I would have been concerned about how unwell Child G was, and I would have had discussions with the nurses and doctors, including the consultant following the ward round. We would again summarise the situation and plan. I was also involved in Child G's care on the 21st of September 2015. Again, as I described in my statement to the police, I have documented in the neonatal unit line insertion and removal record chart that day. There have been several failed attempts to insert a permanent cannula. We're going to come on to this shortly. And whilst I cannot remember, I presume that I was asked to attempt this myself. It appears that I had a few failed attempts before asking Dr. Gibbs to attempt cannulation, who successfully inserted a peripheral intravenous cannula into her left foot. During the cannulation, Child G would have been connected to a Massimo or a Philips monitor. This would not have been disconnected or turned off either by Dr. Gibbs or me during cannulation. This is another very important point that we're going to discuss shortly. I cannot remember any further involvement in Child G's care that day, or if I was present in any conversations at 10:20 relating to her deterioration. I did not have any specific concerns that I would have raised from my recollection. I also cannot remember any debriefs. If one was convened, then my attendance at it would have been useful. So before we go any further, I'm just going to show you what cannulation is. I'm sure lots of people know this. I've been cannulated. I'm sure lots of people have. It's just the medical procedure involving the insertion of a small plastic tube, the cannula, into a vein for administering fluids, medications, or blood products. It's a drip, I guess, is a form of cannulation. So I'm going to move on now to the court proceedings related to Child G, and firstly, the cross-examination of Dr. Harkness. So this is, firstly, Dr. Harkness, I think here is actually being cross-examined by the prosecution, and then Ben Myers will cross-examine him as well. So Dr. Harkness tells the court he was on day shift on the 21st of September. He says he cannot remember, aside from using his notes, the events of that day. That's perfectly reasonable. Court is being shown notes from that day which show there were 7 attempts to cannulate Child G. I should just mention at this point, a lot of this court case is reliant on memory, and these are memory of events that occurred 7 years previously that were much like many other events because they all occurred in the hospital, and these kind of things are happening all the time. And so much of it is reliant on people's recollection of these events. I mean, Child K is entirely based on memory. I will definitely make a video about that at some point. But this is hugely. I mean, you see even with Lucy when she's in the witness box, she's saying, "I can't remember that." She doesn't lie. She just says, "I don't recall." And I think this was held against her in a way. I think in a way it would have been better for her to have said, "Well, I didn't do that. I didn't do this," even though that would have been lying, ironically. In a way, her telling the truth and saying she couldn't remember things that happened 7 years ago that may have been completely innocuous. There's stuff like in the court case about did you put a document in the waste paper document bin? Like in September 2015, 7 years ago. Difficult for anyone to remember, given that it's just one day at work and it's just one. I mean, could you go back 7 years previous and remember when you were at work? Did you throw something in the bin on the 12th of August 2015? Hard to say, really, isn't it? hard to recall. And that's if you're in the best mental state possible. Of course, we know she'd had a breakdown. Understandable, because she'd been mentally torn to pieces at this point. She had to go into the courtroom before everyone else and sit in her seat before everyone else so that she could settle. And she felt that everyone wasn't staring at her. And she sat there and she had either a comforter or a comfort blanket throughout the process. And she was on medication. She had a breakdown. The court case had to be delayed because she had a breakdown. She's suffering from PTSD. And then you're saying to her, "Oh, can you remember if you threw some in the waste paper basket like 7 years ago?" And so much of the court case is reliant on these events that no one can remember. The doctors can't remember them. Like Lucy, I think, has a very good memory in the circumstances. But to base a decision of this nature on these events that are not documented, and you're just asking people, "Do you think this happened?" "Well, I reckon this might have happened." "Can you actually remember?" "Well, no, of course I can't. It was 7 years ago." "Well, we'll just say that this happened." It's frankly, I can't remember if I made this comment previously, but you wouldn't put it in a GCSE project. Let alone should it decide whether or not someone goes to prison for life sentences. That should require the highest standard of evidence. Not this. So much of this court case is just a narrative. It's just people making up stories and saying, "Oh, well, we reckon this happened, so we'll just say that." It's just unbelievable. Frankly completely unbelievable. Although actually, if you look into the conviction of Andrew Malkinson, that's even more unbelievable. Like, there was just no evidence at all. It's just. I mean, I used to think you'd get a fair trial in this country. I was brought up to believe that. I like to think I'm a critical person, that I question everything, but for some reason I thought you would get a fair trial in Britain. But I realise now that so many things happen in the court system that are just farcical. And the thing is, they're not even considered miscarriages of justice. Although the court case related to Andrew Malkinson was farcical, it wouldn't have been considered a miscarriage of justice if he'd actually, like procedurally, it was fine. The only reason the case fell apart was because he wasn't at the crime scene. If he'd been near to the crime scene, he probably never would have been exonerated. I mean, he was exonerated because of DNA evidence, so maybe that would have exonerated him. I don't know, but there was no procedural. They didn't. It's not as if the criminal justice system reflected, yeah, procedurally that wasn't a great court case because there was no evidence. They never said that. They never all the evidence they had was an eyewitness account. That eyewitness account later out turned to be completely incorrect, and then they just assassinated his character in court. That's all they did. If you look up reports, you'll see that they described Andrew Malkinson as a drifter. Like, okay, so he didn't want to stay in one place and do a 9 to 5 job and turn up Monday to Friday every week, which we all know can be soul destroying. So therefore he raped someone. What? It's just total nonsense. I mean, it's actually very difficult to find reporting relate to the Malkinson case, but you just see these ridiculous. That court case would have been from start to finish just a narrative of this guy is guilty, and this is essentially what happened in Lucy Letby's case with some other tenuous evidence tacked on as well. So to return to this document, This talks about the cannulation of child G. Court is being shown notes from that day which show that there were 7 attempts to cannulate child G. This is the second such infant. There's another infant where there were many attempts. I believe it was child A, but I could be incorrect about that, where there were numerous attempts to intubate the child, which is very bad practice. 7 attempts to do something is terrible practice. Dr. Hartness did at least pass this on to Dr. Gibbs, but if you're trying to cannulate someone 7 times, it's not good. Now, I will say in their defence that this is a very, very small child, and it could be a technically tricky operation, but it's still bad practice. Dr. Gibbs says babies such as child G that require a lot of intensive care, there can be issues with cannulation. That's probably an entirely fair remark. Dr. Hartness is recalling the cannulation of child G at around 3:30 British Summer Time that day. He says he was assisting Dr. Gibbs. He said he was there to pass equipment and keep baby still, jobs normally carried out by a nurse. Asked why a nurse did not assist, he said, I expect nurses were very busy but can't be specific why. This is all perfectly fair. Dr. Hartness is now being asked if he remembers whether child G was hooked up to a monitor. He says she was. He's asked if the sensor from the monitor was moved while attempting cannulation. He cannot remember. He cannot remember. Let's just remember that. He is asked if a sensor would ever be moved. He said it would occasionally be moved from one limb to other. He agrees it is important to keep a monitor on and attached. He says it is not safe to turn such a monitor off. Asked if he turned child G's monitor off, he says, I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure I know how to turn off that particular monitor. At no point would I have turned it off. So he's not saying I didn't. He's just saying I wouldn't have done this. But he said already that he has no recollection of this. After the cannulation, Dr. Hartness is asked whether he remembers having any conversations with anyone. He says he has a vague recollection of speaking to a member of nursing staff. Now, I will say about Dr. Hartness, it's entirely reasonable that he only has a vague recollection of these events. There's no particular reason that he should have a crystal clear recollection of a conversation that took place 7 years ago that passed in a second, that was, probably, I think it was taking place very early in the morning. There's no doubt that the doctors on this unit were trying their best. It's very stressful. They do long hours. So I think that we can't be too critical of him not recalling these things, just as Lucy couldn't recall things. Entirely normal. You'd have to be some kind of savant to be able to remember absolutely everything that occurred on the unit, like years and years and years into the past. So this is all reasonable. But the cross-examination is where this becomes significant. Ben Myers KC defending put it to Dr. Hartness that he and Dr. Gibbs left child G behind a screen, detached from the monitor, and had failed to inform nursing staff. Dr. Hartness repeatedly says he can't remember, which is perfectly reasonable. On the monitor being switched off, he flatly says no. You must know very well, Dr. Hartness, that conversation took place. Dr. Hartness said, I can't remember. Mr. Myers said, I suggest a detail like that is something you would not forget. The doctor replied, I disagree. Now, in my view, this is perfectly reasonable cross-examination, but it's also reasonable for Dr. Hartness to say that he can't recall this conversation. That is absolutely fair. But he cannot say so definitively. It's not unreasonable for him to say, I wouldn't have switched off, and for him to believe that he wouldn't have done it. But he can't say definitively that he didn't do it because he can't remember it. Now, the reason he's being asked about this is that a former nursing colleague of Lucy, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was in the witness box during the proceedings related to child G. She was recalling the events the 21st of September. So let's see what she says about it. Court told that child G was cannulated behind a screen and placed on a Masimo monitor, a portable device attached to the patient by a sensor that continually measures oxygen saturations and heart rate levels. After the doctors had gone, but child G was still screened, the nurse told the court that she heard Miss Letby shouting for help. So please note, Lucy is the person that has alerted the doctors to the problems with this infant. Bear in mind, she was not the designated nurse for this infant. She just noticed, she did what a good nurse will do. She came along to look at this very premature infant. She noticed that there were problems. Child G had been kept behind a screen by Dr. Hartness and Dr. Gibbs. She stepped in. She saw there were problems. She shouted for help. She was using Neopuff, form of ventilation, on the infant, who did not look very well at all. So she was trying to respond in the best way possible. She actually was the person who noticed. Well, I don't know if she said she noticed that the monitor screen was black and had been switched off. Who knows if this was Lucy who noticed that or the nurse? It's not entirely clear. I think it's meant to say that the nurse noticed this. The nurse said this was not normal procedure, which is correct. This is the critical point. The nurse, however, has told the court that she asked to review her original statement to police last month, as she had said she had seen in the prosecution opening that there was a suggestion Miss Letby had turned the monitor off. She said, "I knew that not to be the case." It can't be any clearer than that. She tells the court that on 21st of September, 2 doctors came to her to apologise, and they had left the screen in situ and not switched the monitor back on. So there's some cross-examination of this, and there's some discussion about the monitoring and so forth. But she confirmed this version of events, and she's the only person that can remember, bear in mind. Obviously, when Lucy Letby was questioned by the police, she denied turning the monitor off, but actually her version of events was corroborated in court by someone who recalled what happened. Now, the prosecution just attempted to tear this up and say, oh, well, we say she turned the monitor off. Even though the only person that's there, the only person that's present, the only person that observed Lucy Letby, the only person that can remember, the only person that gave a kind of concrete account of what happened says that that's not true. So this is why in the report, the panel report for Child G says there's no evidence Lucy Letby turned the monitor off, which is absolutely true. What has occurred really is some mistakes in cannulation. This child has been kept behind a screen while in significant distress, and then it's clear that there's been this conversation. The doctors have apologised for making a mistake. It's not obviously malignant from the doctors. You know, they came to apologise because they left the screen in situ and not switched the monitor back on. It's the kind of human error that can happen on a unit at any time. We're all going to do things in our working lives that are mistakes, and this is an instance where the doctor had made a mistake. But it's clear from court proceedings, it's clear from the established record that this is what happened. So I'm just going to summarise this section to establish what we know about this monitor and cannulation. The first thing is that Lucy Letby is not the designated nurse for Child G. Secondly, it was Lucy Letby who raised the alarm for Child G and contacted medics, and was also engaged in the process of ventilation when she was struggling. Excuse me. Child G had to be cannulated 7 times, which is extremely bad practice. There is corroborated evidence the medics from the hospital not only made major errors with Child G, but also turned off a monitor. Well, they made mistakes with the monitor that made it turn off anyway. This was recounted by a nurse in court who was actually present at the time. Somehow Lucy Letby was accused of having turned off the monitor, even though this is a complete fabrication with literally zero supporting evidence. So that's actually a very important part of the case for Child G. I'm going to move on now to discuss the multiple collapses and what was said in court by Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin. But this was forwarded by the prosecution as a serious allegation that Lucy Letby deliberately turned the monitor off, when, if we look at the actual events on the unit and what was established in court, it's actually pretty much undeniable that she simply behaved in the way that a responsible nurse should and did everything that would have been required of her. So in this next section, we're going to talk about the numerous collapses and vomiting incidents, plus what was said in court by Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin in relation to the condition of this infant. I just want to remind you firstly that the contention with Child G was that the lawyers have stated that the panel are somehow unaware that rather than being critically unwell at the time of her vomit, Child G was doing well. She deteriorated and became severely unwell after she was attacked. And frankly, suggesting that the panel don't know this or aren't aware of this or haven't taken this into consideration in their forensic investigation of this case is pretty embarrassing as an argument anyway. But we're going to, in this section, we're particularly going to assess this because the point is, they're saying they're really repeating here what I've discussed earlier in the video. The impression that Dr. Evans gave, in particular, throughout the court case of this baby was absolutely fine, then it just suddenly deteriorated for no reason. The only possible explanation can be that Lucy Letby got a syringe and injected milk into its stomach until, yeah, whatever. Not only was this child unwell, but the child was demonstrably collapsing and vomiting on numerous occasions over a period of quite a long extended time. Being transferred in and out of Arrow Park Hospital in the Countess of Chester, plus it's extremely vulnerable to begin with. It's actually, as I say, statistically, the fact this child survived, that was against the odds, particularly on a unit like this. So I'm not sure if that was adequately communicated to the court. In my view, it wasn't. I can't see any evidence that it was adequately communicated, that there was a distinct lack of contextualisation. It is just pretty much, oh, this infant was fine, it was doing okay, it was stable. That's always the word that's used. The infant was stable, then it deteriorated. As if in the history of medicine, no patient has ever been stable and then deteriorated before. Like, that's never happened previously. Usually, once they're stable, that's it. They're fine after that. And you always know when they're going to deteriorate, obviously. It's just claptrap, frankly. But anyway, we'll move on to see what was said in court. So the first thing to note is this is just something that I've written myself. These 2 episodes of projectile vomiting were considered critical, but there were only 2 of numerous such episodes that occurred. Dr. Shuley cited several incidents of projectile vomiting after child G was transferred to Arrow Park Hospital. So the first document we're going to look at is a witness statement of Caroline Oakley. This was another one that was suppressed until February 2025, having been submitted in April. INQ 01013334. In this document, Caroline Oakley says, I cannot recall myself or anyone else present at the handover having any specific concerns about child G's projectile vomiting and frequent collapses. Because it was projectile vomiting, the infant was projectile vomiting and collapsing frequently. It's not just this collapse, it's not just these 2 incidents, it had been continuing for weeks and weeks. And there are numerous collapses that are known about, and there are numerous incidences of vomiting that are known about. It is likely that there are other vomits and other collapses that haven't been recorded or haven't been deemed of any particular significance, but we know about numerous. I believe all the nurses would be concerned if a baby collapsed, as we want our babies to improve and not deteriorate. Following a review of the medical records, which I exhibit as exhibit blah blah blah, I can see that child G was stable and deteriorated overnight. Appropriate interventions were taken to stabilise her, and as such, this would not have caused me undue concern, as this is the nature of neonatal nursing. It is the nature of neonatal nursing, but of course the court never heard about this at any earlier time. So I've just written here, again, as has been seen with other infants, child G collapsed multiple times, and undeniably, Letby was not present or even on duty for many of these collapses. I should reiterate that Lucy wasn't the designated nurse for this infant. And I also wanted to mention here that based on the published transcripts, child G had numerous projectile vomits that Lucy Letby was never associated with. Ben Myers in court reminded Dr. Bohin of one such incident that she didn't observe in the medical notes. And then Dr. Bohin also discounted testimony from the child's father, who witnessed another projectile vomit. So there really were many of these incidents. Well, I'm going to move on now to the actual court case itself. So I appreciate this is already a lengthy video, but it's necessary to demonstrate just how ridiculous what occurred in court was, and also how absurd the statement from the lawyers is. So we're going to go over several things that occurred in court. We're going to begin with this statement. So this is just simply, I believe this is Dr. Evans answering the prosecution counsel, and we just see a bit of a discussion here, and we hear Dr. Evans go, so her RESPs vary between 40 and 50/55. The crosses simply is, I'm not quite sure what the crosses relate to in the context of the fact we know she'd collapsed, so presumably this crosses indicate she was receiving ventilatory support. So, I mean, this is just an account where it's acknowledged that there were numerous collapses. And this is another question to Dr. Evans. This is more related to how he continually told the court that infants were stable and that they were doing fine. Could you find any evidence in the medical notes that during her time at Chester, child G had been unwell up to the point of her collapse? No. Her condition was stable. She was requiring oxygen because she had chronic lung disease. So even that, you could say, could you see any evidence child G was unwell? No. Well, okay, she did have chronic lung disease. You could view that as in itself a contradiction in terms, but the point really related to this is that this is Dr. Evans again asserting that an infant is perfectly okay, is perfectly fine, is stable. And this is where you get this assertion that she was severely unwell after she was attacked and she was basically fine. You know, they're just pulling that from Dr. Evans and what Dr. Evans has stated in court. There's absolutely no medical information, evidence, knowledge that is underpinning that statement. It's just purely recounting what occurred in court, where Dr. Evans has said that the condition of this infant was stable. It was basically fine. Then she just collapsed for absolutely no reason. And then the only reason I could see for it was that, yeah, we know what the allegations were. So far as the issue of infection is concerned, from your interpretation, this is staggering, an incredible thing that Dr. Evans has told the court here. So far as the issue of infection is concerned, from your interpretation of what happened, did you regard infection as being a credible explanation for vomiting and collapse, sometimes at 2 a.m.? No, not at all. Baby G's infection, in my opinion, occurred after the collapse. So according to him, this child did not have an infection. So this is despite the fact that a panel of experts have concluded that had an infection. Numerous people have assessed this case. It was treated in Arrow Park. She was treated in Arrow Park as having had an infection. She was treated for sepsis and noted as having had an infection. Other doctors believe that this infant had an infection. It is noted in medical notes from the time that the child had an infection and was being treated as having had an infection. But Dr. Evans has concluded that child G did not have an infection, but it had an infection later on. After Lucy Letby's intervention, it then later developed an infection. I mean, it's just complete crap, utter crap again. And actually, we see, I believe this lady's name is Dr. Alison Ventris, and we see this is the prosecution cross-examining Dr. Evans. I think you were asked to consider Dr. Ventris' suggestion that baby G's initial collapse when she projectile vomited and 45 millilitres of milk was aspirated from her stomach. We don't know this, by the way, but I'll come on to that later. You were asked to consider whether that was consistent with being the product of an infection. With respect to Dr. Ventris, no, I don't agree with that. I think the infection occurred afterwards. So he's saying this again. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then this is another instance of Dr. Evans being interviewed from the court case. And he's talking about later collapses and desaturations. Then he just said, I didn't look at the later collapse during this. So again, this is just establishing there were other collapses and the kind of shoddy process that he was involved with. And again, this is another thing where this is, I believe, Ben Myers cross-examining, and he talks about a more marked history of vomiting, because there weren't just 2 vomits, there weren't just 2 collapses or deteriorations, there were numerous over weeks and weeks and weeks. These were just the only 2 that they could somehow tenuously link with Lucy Letby. So now we're going to look at some of the court transcripts for child G. And this is probably going to take quite a while. I mean, we could literally go through the whole thing and just look how ridiculous the whole thing is, but that would take hours, and I'm not going to do that. I just want to look at this particular section, which begins with a discussion between defence barrister Ben Myers and Dr. Evans on the subject of projectile vomiting. So I'll read until we need to question what Dr. Evans is saying, which will probably be quite frequent. Projectile vomiting, I'd like to ask you about next, Dr. Evans. Babies may vomit for many reasons, mightn't they? Yes. With more or less force? Yes. Forceful vomiting in a neonate can happen, can't it? I don't use the word, I'm not familiar with the term forceful vomiting. I'm not sure what it means, I'm not being awkward, it has no medical relevance. Sorry about that. I mean, this seems quite pedantic, but let's let that slide. A child that is unwell and is having an effect upon their stomach, a baby like this might projectile vomit. Do you agree? No. There's a division of opinion between you and Dr. Ventris on that, isn't there, Dr. Evans? I don't think so. So there's some further discussion of this, but I'm just firstly going to look at this notion of projectile vomiting. because Dr. Evans essentially suggests that this is an unusual and very significant symptom. But if you look at it, projectile vomiting in newborns where milk or formula is forcibly ejected can be a sign of pyloric stenosis, a condition where the pylorus muscle thickens, causing a blockage and preventing food from passing into the small intestine, requiring medical action. That isn't always the cause of projectile vomiting. It's just a frequently mentioned cause. So I just simply asked here, can neonates have incidents of projectile vomiting when unwell? Yes, neonates can experience projectile vomiting, and it's something that should never be ignored, especially if it's persistent or forceful. So notice they use the word forceful. Dr. Evans says, I don't know what's meant by the word forceful. But there you go. While occasionally spitting up or mild vomiting can be normal in newborns, projectile vomiting is more concerning and could indicate an underlying medical issue. And then you see possible causes of projectile vomiting include pyloric stenosis, infections, e.g. sepsis, and gastroenteritis. Now, it's supposed that it's presumed that this infant had both sepsis and gastroenteritis. Increased intracranial pressure, gastroesophageal reflux. It's also presumed that this infant had gastroesophageal reflux. It's presumed that they had these two infections and gastroesophageal reflux that are literally listed as some of the main causes of projectile vomiting in neonates. But according to Dr. Evans, it can't possibly happen for any other reason. An intestinal obstruction. We see a lot of these infants with intestinal obstruction. I'm not sure about child G. I don't think there is evidence that child G had an intestinal obstruction, although I might be incorrect about that. But I don't think that there was. And also, this kind of bilious vomit, I don't think was observed. That refers to this very specific, I think it's quite thick bilious vomit, but it's green or yellow. So I don't think that's particularly relevant. But we can see from points 2 and firstly, the overall point is, yes, neonates can projectile vomit. And the reasons are also symptoms, conditions that were strongly linked with this infant. So if we move on to these, I just found a few academic papers. So this is Young Infant with Vomiting, written by Sarah Martin. This was published not long before the court case. It's in Wiley Online Library. It just discusses the case of a 6-week male-old infant. In this case, they have pyloric stenosis, projectile vomiting, followed feeding with continued ravenous appetite, weight loss, and dehydration, all reported symptoms. Evidence-based management of neonatal vomiting in the emergency department. Vomiting accounts for up to 36% of neonatal visits to the emergency department. History and physical examination are extremely important in these cases, especially identifying red flags such as projectile emesis. Projectile vomiting and intoxication in the newborn infant. Report of 2 cases due to congenital structure of the urinary tract. Forceful and excessive vomiting, so they use the word forceful again, so that has no scientific basis, according to Dr. Evans. But unfortunately, this guy, Lewis A. Koch, who's actually written a published academic paper, unlike Dr. Evans, has used the word forceful. So, I mean, clearly projectile and forceful can be considered fairly interchangeable. But we just go on to talk about infants who exhibited symptoms of anorexia, projectile vomiting, drowsiness, and progressive and generalised edema. And then lastly, there's this report, which is a very authoritative report that's been written recently. To be fair, this was after the court case in 2023, vomiting in neonates. We see here type of vomiting. Vomiting can be classified according to its causal characteristics. We can classify vomiting as projectile or non-projectile. Projectile vomiting refers to forceful vomiting and is usually occurred with pyloric stenosis or increased intracranial pressure. Now, when I started to look up these papers, I didn't realise they were all going to use the word forceful, just to completely contradict what Dr. Evans said. But as you see, they're all stating that projectile vomiting is a recognised condition in infants, unlike what Dr. Evans has stated here. So I'm not familiar with the term forceful vomiting. So that comment has been ridiculed. And this idea that projectile vomit could occur when a child is unwell, he just says no. He just says, no, this cannot happen. I mean, if this didn't, again, this would be funny if it didn't have such serious consequences. But I just wanted to deal firstly with that issue of projectile vomit in some detail. We're going to go on to look at the remainder of this section, not the whole transcript, but several pages of this transcript. So I'd say that this assertion of Dr. Evans is simply categorically incorrect, but we'll move on to the remainder of this transcript, although we're going to have to pause on a few occasions to fact check what he's saying. A child that is unwell and is having an effect upon the stomach, a baby like this might projectile vomit. Do you agree? No. There's a division of opinion between you and Dr. Ventris on that, isn't there, Dr. Evans? I don't think so. You say with respect to evidence, you don't agree with her evidence on this. I don't think Dr. Ventris said that babies will have projectile vomiting as a common side effect complication of an illness. I don't think she said that. Sorry, what I disagree with Dr. Ventris is she said infection caused the vomiting. I disagree. Yes, the infection occurred after the collapse. But you heard me put to her by reference to her statement where she said that projectile vomiting could be caused from infection. And in this comment here, we see the arrogance again of Dr. Evans. If she said that, fine, but I don't agree with her. I'm not being condescending, but she was a registrar at the time, and we've heard, I'm not going to criticise junior doctors for their opinion, okay? I'm not going to do that. I think it's unfair. I mean, what a wanker. And I think a lot of what we see from Dr. Evans in this case and in the aftermath is, you might think, and you could easily get the impression that, he wants Lucy Letby to go to prison. I think purely the only thing he's focused on is, I'm always right, I'm always correct, no one is ever allowed to question anything that I say, and he just simply cannot accept that. So here Dr. Ventris has given a very reasonable opinion. She's very qualified to do so, and we'll see later on that another opinion that she gives, Dr. Evans pours scorn on that, but she's correct and he's wrong. But the letter he wrote to Channel 5 was, he says, I'm not being condescending. You are being condescending. You're condescending all the time. The letter that he wrote to Channel 5 was unbelievably condescending. And also, he's dropped himself in hot water because he's shown that he's changed his diagnoses. But here, he's belittling Dr. Ventris because she's a junior doctor, but actually she turns out to be correct. She's correct about this infection, and she's later correct about another point that we're going to look at as well. Well, is it possible for baby G to have vomited very hard, projectile vomiting, because she was unwell? Do you agree or disagree with that? No, not that degree of vomiting, no. Sorry, and if she had vomited because she was unwell, where would the 45 millilitres still in the stomach have come from? Now we're going to come on to the point of, he asserted that there was a certain amount in the stomach, but we don't know, because it was never measured, it couldn't be measured. This is a complete fabrication, as is discussed in this exchange. We can't actually say, let's say that there was more than 45 millimetres in the stomach at the time of the vomit, that for whatever reason more milk had gone in there than should have been there for that one feed. We can't say how much extra there actually was, can we? He doesn't say no, he just says we can say there was a fair bit. So now he's backing away. He's already backing away from his assertion that was 45 millilitres without saying, I'm still right. We can say there was a fair bit. I'm obviously wrong that it was 45 millilitres because that's an estimation. And what Ben Myers has said here is categorically correct. But I'm not going to admit that I was wrong. I'm just going to change the terms of reference at this point. There was quite a lot, I would say. We don't know, do we? Yes, we do. We don't, because if there was, you would just say here that we know there was 45 millilitres. We don't know because it wasn't measured. And indeed, he says here, there's no measurement of how much vomit there was, is there? No. Right, so therefore, you just said, we don't know, yes. There's no measurement, no. So therefore, we don't know. And this kind of absolutely ridiculous cross-examination where Dr. Evans insists on being correct when he's categorically and demonstrably incorrect, that occurs all the way through the court case. With other expert witnesses who are interviewed, even Dr. Bohin to a certain extent, they're willing to concede things. Dr. Bohin is pretty firm as well, but not to this ridiculous degree. Other expert witnesses, most notably Professor Sally Kinsey, she was quite willing to concede that she doesn't know anything about air embolus, and she also said the literature that was used in support of it has many limitations, and she made other concessions because she behaved in the way that an expert witness should. I still say that she made significant errors and said things to the court that should never have been said, but she behaved in a manner that was more respectful, appropriate, and professional. So anyway, no, but it's a lot of vomit, it's a lot of vomit, you know. We don't know because we don't have an image of it, do we? No, but it's a lot of vomit. You don't know how much there was, Dr. Evans. There was quite a lot. 45 millilitres is not more than this glass. So he's now confirmed, he's now saying, oh, it could easily have been 45 millilitres because look, I've got a glass here. You've got vomit on the chair, you've got vomit on the canopy, and you've got 45 millilitres or more still left in the stomach. So now he's saying it could be more. It could be more than 45 millilitres. That's an awful lot of vomit. And if for whatever reason child G had not digested the milk that had been given to her in earlier feed and milk had been fed over that, that could mean there was more than 45 millilitres in the stomach, couldn't it? That is pure hypothesis. Everything he said in this court case, particularly in relation to this is an absolute hypothesis, but everything he said in this court case is a hypothesis. There was no milk in her stomach because the pH was 4 and milk is neutral, therefore the pH would not have been 4. I'm not going to test that particular contention. I'm not going to go back and debate the evidence of Nurse E with you. I assume that's supposed to be Child E, but it could be Nurse E, I don't know. With you, Dr. Evans, we've heard it. Anyway, I disagree with that point. So now we're going to come on to something that we are going to test briefly. Gastroesophageal reflux can cause projectile vomit, can't it? Now, I was very interested when I saw the term gastroesophageal reflux because I suffered with this when I was younger. And I've had a terrible digestive system all my life, and I had to have what's called a fundoplication, where you have keyhole surgery and they turn your stomach upside down and it narrows the gap into the esophagus, essentially, so you get less acid coming up, or acid can't come up, which is not a very pleasant operation. You have to go on a liquid diet afterwards, and then I had to eat scrambled eggs, and for 4 weeks you have the most boring diet of like scrambled eggs, soft mashed potato, and I lost like nearly 2 stone because you can't eat properly. It was pretty horrible, but it did kind of solve the problem, although my digestive system still isn't very good. But it was nice to see this thing that I actually recognised. So gastroesophageal reflux, it just refers to acid coming up from the stomach, and this can create nausea. It can often create like furring of the tongue. It can be very uncomfortable. It can make eating difficult from a comfort point of view, and there are various other side effects. It's not life-threatening. I don't know if it can be. I would imagine in a neonate, it's a lot more problematical because they're more vulnerable. For me, when I had it, it was sort of developed when I was in my late teens, I think. Well, that was the first time I recognised it, and then it would continue until I had my operation. But it wasn't life-threatening for me. I don't know whether it's life-threatening for a neonate. I'm not going to look that up at this point, but it's clearly would be a far more serious issue for a baby that was born that was 500 grams. The discharge letter from RI Park from mid-August did not mention gastroesophageal reflux. What it says was in terms of active issues, chronic lung disease and establishing feeds. She was on Gaviscon. I mean, this bit isn't very interesting. All I will say is that the panel have cited gastroesophageal reflux, the panel of neonatal experts. Is gastroesophageal reflux something that can develop in a baby over time? So they're not born with it, but it develops over time. It depends on the cause, actually. It depends on the cause. So no, I mean, it doesn't occur in 3 hours between one feed and the next. I'll tell you that. Okay. So this is the point that we're going to contest. So I've simply asked the question of, can gastroesophageal reflux develop rapidly in a neonate? Yes. Gastroesophageal reflux can develop rapidly in a neonate, and it's actually quite common in newborns due to several physiological factors. And then there's an explanation of why it can develop quickly. Immature lower esophageal sphincter, the muscle that prevents stomach contents from moving back up, is not fully developed. This immaturity can lead to sudden onset of reflux. Neonates are on a milk-only diet, which is more likely to come back up, especially when combined with lying flat most of the time. Small stomach capacity. Their stomachs are tiny, so it's easy for even a small amount of overfeeding or trapped air to cause regurgitation. Bear in mind, this is a particularly small infant, even for a neonate, so this point applies even more markedly. Supine position. Babies are mostly lying on their backs, which can make reflux worse. If the reflux is frequent, forceful, projectile, or associated with poor weight gain, irritability, etc., it may be GERD and needs closer evaluation. So it's possible, again, that there were observation issues on this unit, and that when these issues of vomiting and incidents of vomiting occurred, that the nurses and consultants and junior doctors and registrars didn't recognise how potentially dangerous this was. And that would be, or they may not even have recognised it was projectile vomiting. We see nurses talking about this. There's no reason for concern. I wouldn't particularly consider it to be projectile vomiting. I would look at the overall picture of the infant. So it's possible that they've missed very serious symptoms. So I've asked here, is it feasible for there to be no signs of gastroesophageal reflux in a neonate, and for this condition to then observably develop within a few hours within the first few weeks of life? Yes, it's feasible for a neonate to show no signs of GER initially, and then for symptoms to emerge within a few hours or days in the first few weeks of life. And then so here, I'm not going to go over all of this again because it's quite complex. A lot of it reiterates what we've looked at in the previous question, but this is interesting that subtle signs might be missed. Early signs can be easily overlooked or not attributed to reflux right away. It's common for more noticeable symptoms to appear seemingly suddenly once GER progresses or becomes more symptomatic. So we see Dr. Evans here in this transcript. He says, "Oh, there would have been signs again, but these signs can easily be missed." And then he denies the fact there's gastroesophageal reflux, whereas a far more qualified panel said that there is very likely, or indeed confirmed, GER in this infant. I just wanted to show as well here that I asked the same question to Google, and it came up with exactly the same answer. Yes, it's possible for neonates to initially show no signs of gastroesophageal reflux, and for the condition to then become observable within a few hours. So I'm going to continue with the with the court transcript now, and pretty soon we'll be fact checking something else Dr. Evans says. So we're talking about Ben Myers here talking about gastroesophageal reflux occurring over a period of time, and he says when we move to beyond 7th September, as we're going to do, we see that child G was a baby who had a marked predisposition to vomit, didn't she? Once we go beyond 7th September, and I'd still rather talk about this later, she's so awfully compromised by the brain oxygen deprivation, etc., etc. This isn't particularly interesting. Ben Myers talks about him constructing an opinion in support of the prosecution. He goes on and on about, well, I'm not doing that. Where infection is concerned, this is the significant part. Where infection is concerned, the CRP, I'll just show you what this is. CRP, C-reactive protein reading, is a blood test that measures the level of C-reactive protein in the body. This protein is produced by the liver in response to inflammation, and a high CRP level indicates that inflammation is present. So it's essentially a blood test. By 218, where infection is concerned, the CRP in child G was at 28 by about 218 on the 7th, wasn't it? We know that as a fact. 2:80 in the afternoon, yes, 12 hours later, etc. And by 10:53, I presume that means a little before 5 to 11 in the evening, it was up to 106. That's consistent with infection, isn't it? Yes. We know that by the time she was at Arrow Park on the 9th, it was at 218. That's right, yes, I remember that. That could be consistent with infection developing before the vomit or after the vomit, couldn't it? No. So here, he just said, that's consistent with infection. And then he said, that could be consistent with infection developing before the vomit or after the vomit, couldn't it? No. So, I mean, that is just inconceivable as to how you could say that. And then Ben Myers said, well, it could be, couldn't it? No, you're wrong. But we're going to go on to why Dr. Evans says this and why he's wrong about why he says this in a second. It takes between 24 and 48 hours for CRP to peak, doesn't it? It varies, actually. What you cannot do is you can't do a case-controlled study on the rate of growth or rate of development of CRP. In most cases, CRP is raised at the time the infection presents, not in all cases, but in some cases. So what you've got is, and I don't know whom you're quoting, but the paper I read. So bear in mind, all he's doing all the way through this court case and all the way through the process, the 5-year process with the police, is just digging around for papers, then taking something out of a paper and saying, this is the case, this is true, this is categorically correct. Essentially, he's doing what I'm doing, but with more medical knowledge than me and a significantly stronger medical background. But he doesn't really know about this topic. He's just looking at academic paper and he's saying, the paper I read is that CRP is always abnormal by 24 hours plus. So then Ben Myers says to him, Dr. Ventris agreed it's 24 to 48 hours to peak. I haven't got a transcript. I'm not sure if that's what she agreed with. But anyway, as I said, I'm not here to criticise junior doctors in training. He says, well, quite obviously criticising them. She's giving her evidence now. Is she a consultant now, Dr. Evans? Yes, well, fine, but she wasn't at the time. But she's not giving the evidence at the time. She's giving it now. Yes, but giving her evidence now she is, and she agrees with that, doesn't she? If she wants to agree with that, we'll have to have a respectful disagreement. In the majority of babies who have an infection, so now it's the majority. Now it's the majority. Before it was all of them, now it's the majority. Right, of infection, okay. Not all of them, not every one of them, as we've discussed, blah, 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 on he goes, right. So, I asked the question of ChatGPT, if an incident in a neonate causes CRP to peak, is it true that this peak will categorically be reached within 24 hours, or can it take longer than this? Great question, it's a subtle one too, especially neonates. C-reactive protein is an acute phase reactant that increases in response to inflammation or infection. In neonates, CRP kinetics are somewhat different from those in older children or adults. Here's what the evidence and clinical practice suggest. CRP levels typically begin to rise within 6 to 8 hours after the onset of a significant inflammatory stimulus such as infection. Peak levels are usually reached around 24 to 48 hours after the insult. In neonates, especially preterm infants, the response may be delayed or blunted, so a CRP peak may not be reached within exactly 24 hours in all cases. It's not categorically true that the peak will always occur within 24 hours. So the short answer is no, it's not categorically true that the CRP will peak within 24 hours in neonates. It can take longer, often up to 48 hours, depending on the timing and nature of the inflammatory event. So again, I've asked the same question to Google. No, it's not true that CRP will always peak within 24 hours after an incident in a neonate. CRP levels can rise and peak at different times depending on the specific situation, but generally the peak can occur between 36 and 48 hours after the initial stimulus. So it's literally exactly what Dr. Ventris said in court that Dr. Evans is disagreeing with, but Dr. Evans is categorically wrong again. So we've fact-checked 3 things that he stated just in this very short period of time that lasts for a few minutes within this court case, and he's wrong about all 3 of them. Categorically incorrect about all 3 of them. Now, I could spend longer looking at more academic papers, but I feel this video is long enough already. But all that needs to be said is Dr. Evans was completely wrong in his assertion here. So he can't respectfully disagree, because all he's done is look up academic papers, found one of them in an absolute mirroring of what occurred with the air embolus cases, where in the air embolus cases he found the Lee and Tanswell paper and then he misinterpreted that. Here he's found an academic paper that says it's 24 hours, and that's incorrect because we know categorically he's wrong about that, because he's not an expert on this subject. He's just looked up literature much as I can and much as anyone can. The difference is that he's done a bad job. It wasn't very difficult for me to find this information. I could do it in a much more thorough way, and I could go over countless academic papers. I just did a few of those papers with regard to the previous topic. But I'm not going to do that here because it's just clear that he's completely wrong. And then there's some discussion here about bowel problems, watery stool issues. He's talking about gastrocolic reflux. And then he goes on to talk about pneumonia and infection being present at Arrow Park Hospital, which is clearly true. Dr. Evans is resistant to this because he's discounted infection in every single infant in the case, even though there's signs of infant in the vast majority. The signs of infection in the vast majority of infants in this case, for starters, there's signs of sepsis in the majority of infants. Then there's other signs of infection and different infections in several other infants. It's virtually every infant in this case, there are signs of infection. So Ben Myers points this out to him, talks about Arrow Park, and he's saying here, you cannot, to be clear about this, you say it probably kicked in them, you cannot discount the possibility it was present and kicked in at some time before the vomit. You can't discount that, can you? No clinical evidence whatsoever to back up that it's not hypothesis, because there's signs of infection. Everyone else apart from Dr. Evans has pointed to this infection, apart from Dr. Evans himself. It's Dr. Evans who has the hypothesis. I'm not going to repeat what I've already put you about the CRP, but I'm just asking, it's something that cannot be discounted, is it? So he doesn't even answer that, he just says it's not what caused her collapse. If there's an infection she's suffering from, will that interfere with her ability to digest milk? Oh, yes. And if she had an infection, if she received more milk than she had received, is that more likely to precipitate a vomit? So it goes on with, we could go on forever looking at all this court transcript where Dr. Evans literally drops clangor after clangor, makes ridiculous statement after ridiculous statement, poorly founded arguments, claims that don't have any foundation or any support. Essentially, rather snidely attacking Dr. Ventris, who is actually correct about her assertion, and so on and so forth, denying the fact there's infection when there clearly is infection, discounting or diminishing other aspects of vomiting and other collapses. And you just see this throughout the entire court case, but I just particularly want to highlight this section because it's very important in the overall picture of what we're discussing. We're going to move on now to look at what Dr. Bohin said in court with regard to child G. So we're going to read quite a lot of this court transcript. It begins with where Ben Mize cross-examines Dr. Bohin. So they're talking about this amount of milk that's supposed to have been aspirated. Dr. Bohin, you described this as a process of simple arithmetic. Yes. In terms of working out that she must have had more than 40 millilitres at or after the 9 a.m. feed. Yes. Of course, we don't know, do we, how much milk, if any, there was in her stomach from the 45 millilitre feed she had at 6 a.m. We don't know that for sure, do we? We don't know that for sure. So immediately, she's already torpedoed the entire prosecution argument. This is just it's an estimation. This should never appear in a court case because they've just essentially made something up, and they've both conceded this. It's not like they've fought against this. It's not as if Evans and Bohin have tried to buttress their opinion and try to actually make it stand up in court. They've just accepted immediately that this is made up, and Dr. Evans was forced to admit that it was made up. It's completely fabricated. I mean, it is. He's saying other people have created a hypothesis. I mean, this is a complete and utter hypothesis from start to finish, including the fact that, as I say, they have literally fabricated this figure. We don't know that for sure, but what we do know is that she'd been tolerating her feeds very well and there had been no episodes of vomiting apart from very minor vomits prior to that. Not true. So that's not true for starters. The numerous episodes of vomiting, we've established that in this video, they're documented, they're known to be the case. You cannot say with any confidence whatsoever that these vomits were more serious than others. Nurses on the unit have indicated this. I mean, this is essentially crap, again. So she had been tolerating her feeds, which means that her stomach is likely to have been empty prior to the 9 o'clock feed. So she's not saying it definitely was. We don't know. We don't know for sure how much, no. So she agrees. And we don't know, in fact, the size of the vomits that she had, do we? We don't. So she's agreeing again. And this aspect of the court case is surreal. But nurses are very good at describing whether vomiting are just a posset, which would just be a mouthful of vomit, which is completely normal and common in babies. Yeah. And they all reported that there were big vomits previously. Dr. Evans has just discounted them for the court case. Nurses will say a baby's had a small vomit, a moderate vomit, or a large vomit. So yes, whilst you can't actually measure the number of millimetres for a nurse to describe something as a large vomit, it's a significant amount of milk. I mean, that is all just complete crap again. I just asked that because it's been described by you and another witness as arithmetic, but we don't actually have the basic figures, do we? No, we don't. Just what would be normal practice for nurses when they're describing vomiting? They have no way of measuring it, so they describe it in terms of mild, moderate, or large. So they just contradicted their own reports explicitly. Whatever lies behind this, whatever happened in terms of scale and consequence, this is very different from the event of 7th of September, isn't it? Well, not really, because on 7th of September there were projectile vomits, which, as I said in my evidence at that time, is extremely unusual for premature babies. Untrue. Again, untrue. It's not extremely unusual. It's somewhat unusual to say this. I mean, this is a value judgment, essentially. But as we've seen, projectile babies can experience instances of projectile vomiting. It's not as unusual as she's suggesting, like, basically is never seen. That's not the case at all. And also, she's diminishing and underestimating the number of vomits that occurred and the severity of those vomits that occurred previously. And of course, I should have re-emphasised once again, they fabricated evidence, literally fabricated it for this child. And not only have they fabricated it, they've conceded it in their cross-examination. So this baby had 2 large projectile vomits resulting in clinical compromise. So she dropped her saturations and became blue. So there's a lot of similarities with the event of earlier in September. To remind the members of the jury, though, they may remember actually 7th of September arises out of follows a feed at about 2 o'clock in the morning, didn't it? Yes. Then the jury may remember a little while later there was a series of significant desaturations that baby G underwent, weren't there? So these were deteriorations. Dr. Bohin concedes this immediately. Dr. Ventris gave evidence about how that went on until about 6:13 in the morning, didn't it? Yes. And it was necessary for it to be ventilated, wasn't it? Yes. And there was the business of the endotracheal tube and it being replaced in the repeat collapses. That's correct, isn't it? Yes, that's correct. So these are all previous instances of vomiting, previous collapses, previous instances of deterioration. This is not contested anyway. Dr. Bohin cannot contest this because she's more reasonable than Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans would try and come up with some bullshit if he was being cross-examined at this point, as we saw. But he had to concede all these things, and Dr. Evans is just conceding them immediately. And ultimately, Baby G had to be transferred to Arrow Park Hospital, didn't she? Yes. So when I'm suggesting that what happened on the 21st is not the same scale as what happened on the 7th, it really isn't the same scale, is it? It's not the same scale. So she's conceding that immediately. But the events with the vomiting and the excess milk are strikingly similar. The repercussions are not, but the events are almost identical. Perhaps what you mean is the mechanism, the projectile vomiting is identical. Yes. That's what you're saying if you don't mind me putting it that way. Yes. All right, as it happens, when we look at Baby G after her return from Arrow Park Hospital, as we go into late September and October 2015, she did display a history of regular vomiting, didn't she? Yes, she did. Vomiting became much more a feature of Baby G after around 3rd of October that year. Prior to that, vomits were very small and intermittent, but vomiting became much more of a feature after 3rd of October. I'm going to describe. So bear in mind, I want to just illustrate this for a second. So they are saying issues of projectile vomiting were significant. Now she's had issues around this period, before this period, after this period. And they just say, Dr. Evans claims, oh, these two infants are really significant, and we've estimated this figure, and we've estimated this, and we've assumed this, and because of this, we've assumed and come to the conclusion that Lucy Letby's injected milk, even though there's more vomits later on. And it's absolutely ridiculous. This is why this verdict and this evidence and what was presented in court is just savaged by healthcare professionals that look at it. I'm going to describe that what we have on the 21st, or rather just that we have on the 21st September, fits a pattern of vomiting that follows on from going forwards. But she then just makes this claim about projectile vomiting, blah, blah, blah. I don't know how much of this I can honestly read because it just goes on this ridiculous vein. But I'll just read this bit here. From 3rd of October to 8th of October, child G is recorded as having 1 to 2 vomits each day. These varied from small to large, and some were aftercares, i.e. after a nappy change where the legs are lifted. Domperidone was added to the anti-flux regime on 17th of October because of the vomiting. So Ben Myers here is just reading out information that indicates this baby had a lot of vomits. Some of them were large vomits. They varied. They could have been reasonably described as projectile vomiting, and this continued for quite a significant period of time. And then he's just going over some of the documentation that proves that further still. And then he talks about more large vomits, and there are problems with the infant, and it has to be put on 3-hourly feeds. And then on 9th of October, I believe there are further problems with more vomits. Yeah, largely tested milky vomits on the 9th of November, which is from Elsa Simpson, noting this in the notes, who's a nurse at the hospital. So here as well, Dr. Bohin talks about the infant being treated for gastroesophageal reflux. Now, Dr. Evans has discounted gastroesophageal reflux completely, but the child is showing signs of gastroesophageal reflux. It's being treated for gastroesophageal reflux, and she's experiencing numerous episodes of vomiting. But Dr. Evans has just discounted this and said, oh, it has to be Lucy Letby injecting milk into her stomach. And then it continues with promise projectile and quite large in size. This is vomit. This is another entry. A vomit at 1900 hours that is projectile and quite large in size. Baby G was uncomfortable prior to this and unsettled, otherwise very willing herself. This is another example of projectile vomiting, isn't it, Dr. Bohin? That's what the nurse has recorded. Yes. Yes. You had said that there were no more. I appreciate it's one amongst all of them, but that's there, isn't it? Well, I've reviewed all of her feeds, of which over that period of time, there were many, many, many feeding charts to review. So if I missed a projectile vomit, you have missed it. Not if you missed it. You have missed it because the nurse has written it down and it's now been read out to you. So it's not if, you have missed it. That's also associated with the passing of a watery stool as it happens, isn't it? On that occasion, yes. Yes, all right, we'll move on to page 7485. This must have taken some reading, you have to say. On the left-hand side, we've got an entry by Kate Bissell, And it continues 3-hourly feeds, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read all this out because it goes on for a very long time. Care taken at approximately 800 hours, cot space checked, baby remained self-ventilating in air, baby G had large vomit with wind following feed. And just to conclude, there's something else to bear in mind, Dr. Bowen, but I repeat it because it's a while since we had the evidence. We had a statement read by baby G's father who said this, talking about 7th of September. It's at page 1795. I have seen baby G projectile vomit on other occasions since this incident. On 3 occasions, they were talking about projectile vomit being linked to reflux, and this is on the 7th of September. And now Dr. Evans completely discounts this evidence, which is ironic because at other stages in the court case, she elevated the importance of eyewitness accounts and accounts given by parents. She elevated them to great importance. Here, she's saying, oh, the child G's father doesn't know what he's talking about. With the greatest respect to baby G's father, parents quite commonly will report their child projectile vomiting, and that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as health professionals would mean by projectile vomiting, where vomit would go some distance. What parents commonly describe as projectile vomiting is what I would say is forceful vomiting. Dr. Evans doesn't know what forceful vomiting is, but not projectile as it goes a huge distance. Those are my questions. Thank you, Dr. Bowen. So as you can see, it's a very muddled picture around this infant, a very tenuous case that's been put forward by the prosecution. There are numerous vomits. There are other projectile vomits, there are other collapses, there are other deteriorations, and Dr. Evans in particular with the support of Dr. Bowen, has picked out 2 of them and said, oh, these are really significant. The only possible explanation is that Lucy Letby has injected milk into this infant. There can't be any gastroesophageal reflux, even though it's been treated for gastroesophageal reflux, even though other nurses and doctors have stated there's a clear picture of gastroesophageal reflux. It is an absolute train wreck, the evidence that's been presented in court. And this is the evidence and the conclusions that is completely relied on by the Thirlwall lawyers in the original Times document. So I'm going to summarise now everything in this video. I understand it's a very long video, but the statement that is made by the Thirlwall lawyers can be utterly annihilated. I mean, you could go into more detail than I have here. I've obviously gone into a lot of detail, but I just wanted to go through everything and make it clear that the statement that is made really just has no merit or foundation whatsoever. So I'm now finally going to summarise this video on child G. So child G was an extremely premature infant, having been born at 23 weeks, some 4 months before her birth would have been expected. Child G was also an extremely low birth weight infant, weighing just 535 grams at birth. The mother of child G endured a particularly complicated pregnancy, including 1 serious incident just days before she gave birth. The initial clinical picture of child G meant that the infant was extremely vulnerable. In fact, her chances of survival were quite small, certainly less than 35%, and it was sadly overwhelmingly likely that the child would develop severe disabilities even if she survived. Because child G was so premature, the infant couldn't even be born at the Council Chester Hospital due to restrictions, and thus the birth of the infant took place at Arrow Park Hospital in Liverpool. Partly due to this issue and also due to deficits of capability at the Council Chester, child G was transferred multiple times during her existence. During the vast majority of her time in hospital, child G received 100% oxygen ventilation and was kept alive solely by this respiratory support. Child G was notably suffering with sepsis, with indicators for the infection noted at the time, both at the Council Chester and Arrow Park Hospital. Child G was indeed treated for sepsis at both institutions. Aside from sepsis, child G was suffering with several other health problems, including chronic lung disease from birth. The panel of neonatal experts who assessed child G described her as suffering with a catalogue of chronic problems. Dr. Evans changed his opinion on child G literally during the court case. When writing to Channel 5 in 2024, Dr. Evans attempted to claim that several events in the case had been several infants that should be in the case have been destabilised via a combination of milk and air, but this was categorically untrue, and he must surely have been aware of this. In fact, child G was the only infant in the court case in which allegations of overfeeding with milk were made. This makes very little sense considering that Lucy Letby had supposedly used other methods for every other child in the case, but then suddenly decided to throw milk into the mix with child G. Two particular instances of vomiting were cited as significant in the case of child G, but it is undeniable that the child experienced countless incidences of both vomiting and deterioration. It should be emphasised that Lucy Letby was not present for these other incidents and wasn't the designated nurse for child G. In fact, arguably Lucy Letby wasn't really present for one of the incidents included in the court case, as she only raised the alarm as a non-designated nurse when she noticed that there were problems with child G, hardly the act of a guilty person. There was some discussion of a monitor being turned off in court by Lucy Letby, but the evidence in fact does not support this in the slightest, and instead indicates strongly that this was an unintentional medical error by Dr. John Gibbs and Dr. David Harkness. The mechanism of deliberately overfeeding infants with milk is ridiculous for numerous reasons. Overfeeding with milk is logistically unfeasible, particularly when conducted in the manner suggested in court. It would be practically impossible to overfeed an infant with a bottle, and even harder with breastfeeding, let alone via the mechanism suggested in court. Overfeeding an infant with milk is also highly unlikely to be successful in significantly destabilising the infant. It is not really even clear what the allegations are with relation to child G, as the infant recovered from the supposedly significant collapses and was in a perilous state anyway. It is very sad that child D developed cerebral palsy, but according to documented medical statistics, serious disability was bordering on inevitable in this tragic case. Even leaving this aside, the prosecution case for child G required numerous far-fetched assumptions and fabrications, along with several baseless assertions and estimations. It is also clear from even a relatively brief assessment of the evidence provided by Dr. Evans that he made numerous assertions that are categorically incorrect. Healthcare professionals, in my experience, treat this overfeeding of milk hypothesis with universal derision and ridicule. So if we return to the initial statement made in this Times article and by the family's lawyers said, rather than being critically unwell at the time of her vomit, child G was doing well. She deteriorated and became severely unwell after she was attacked. Now, if you just read that article, that may seem superficially reasonable, but as we now know from looking at all the evidence related to this case, it is a statement that is complete without foundation, and we know that what was asserted in court is just complete rubbish, and that what the panel has asserted is almost infinitely superior in terms of its credibility. So that was a long video. It was hard to make, but there is so much to say on this case, and there were so many problems with the court case and with the evidence that was presented in court. I felt I needed to go into considerable detail. The next video is going to be on child A and child F. That will be much shorter than this video. I'd just like to finish by saying, if you have any queries, comments, questions, or corrections, please do leave them. And I'm also supposed to encourage you to subscribe, like the video, etc. This is all good for the algorithm, so I'm told. I really appreciate the support I've received, and I will continue making these videos. There's going to be a couple more on these lawyer statements, then I'm going to move on to looking at the insulin cases. I may make a large video of them all joined together, or I may create a playlist, or I may do both. I haven't decided, but I hope this has been informative for people, and if you do have any comments, please do leave them.